Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Phantom CB Radio, from the testimony of Mike Rodriguez, truck driver. The road at night has its own kind of silence. It is not the silence of a quiet room, nor the stillness of a sleeping town, but rather a layered quiet, where the only sound is the hum of the engine and the rhythm of tires against endless asphalt. I had spent 23 years learning the texture of that silence, and I had grown to find comfort in it. Yet one night, in the cold heart of February, that silence was broken by something I still struggle to explain. Something that felt less like sound and more like the voice of the dead, reaching across the years to remind me that the road never forgets. I was driving east on Interstate 40, hauling a refrigerated trailer full of electronics. It was an ordinary load, the kind of freight I had carried dozens of times before. My rig was a 2018 Peterbilt 579, reliable, solid, and fitted with a Cobra 29 CB radio that I had installed myself. That radio was my lifeline. It kept me connected to other drivers, allowed me to hear about speed traps, weather updates, and the simple chatter that keeps loneliness at bay on long runs. That night, I had it tuned to Channel 19 as I always did, catching bits of conversation from other truckers pushing through the snowstorm that had settled over the Texas Panhandle. The weather had shifted faster than forecast. The radio reports earlier in the day had mentioned light flurries, nothing serious, but by the time I was deep into that stretch between Amarillo and the Oklahoma border, the snow was falling hard enough to swallow the horizon. Visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. My headlights cut tunnels into the white, but beyond them, the world dissolved into shadow and haze. My mirrors reflected only emptiness. Long black strips of road vanishing into the blur of falling snow. Even the occasional glow of another driver's lights had disappeared. I was alone, wrapped in darkness and frost, the kind of solitude that makes you listen harder to every creak, every hum, every whisper of static. And then the radio went silent. Not just quiet, dead. 1 second there was the soft hiss of background static, the occasional squawk of a driver giving a mile marker, the low comfort of a world that was still awake with me. The next second, nothing. No static, no chatter, no sound at all. Absolute silence. I adjusted the squelch, tapped the mic, even checked the power connection beneath the dash. The unit was lit, the meters responding, but there was no sound. That kind of silence is wrong on a CB. Even in the middle of nowhere, there is always something. A hiss, a crackle, a faint voice bouncing from miles away. To have nothing was unsettling. I leaned back into my seat, telling myself it was probably a loose wire. That was when the burst of static hit, so sharp and sudden that it made me flinch. The squelch was still set high, but the sound tore through like the roar of a storm. And then, beneath the static, a voice. Hollow, distant, echoing like it came from the bottom of a well. Easterbound Pete with a reefer trailer. You need to slow down in this weather, driver. I froze, my hand tightening on the wheel. They had described my rig exactly. I was indeed eastbound, driving a Peterbilt, hauling a refrigerated trailer. The snow still fell thick and heavy, and in my mirrors, the road stretched empty for miles. There were no other headlights, no shadows of trucks or cars. Whoever had spoken seemed to be talking only to me. This is Eastbound Pete, I said cautiously, pressing the mic. Who am I talking to? For 10 long seconds, there was only static, the kind of empty noise that scratches at the nerves. And then the voice came back, clearer this time, though still carrying that hollow distortion. You're making good time, Mike. Been pushing hard since you left Amarillo, haven't you? The air in the cab seemed to thin. My name. He had said my name. I had not given it. I had not broadcast it, yet the voice knew not only who I was, but also where I had left. I glanced at my logbook. Amarillo, departure 9:15 p.m. The voice had details no stranger should know. My mouth felt dry as I asked, "How do you know my name?" "Oh, Mike," the voice sighed almost fondly. "I know a lot about you. 23 years on the road, married to Linda for 18. Emma in college down in Texas, David just starting in Oklahoma. You drive this route 6 times a year, and when you stop in Oklahoma City, you always order the chicken fried steak at Mel's Diner." My hands trembled on the wheel. Every detail was true. I thought about my wife, my kids, the small routines that had become my life, and I realized, with a coldness that spread down my spine, that I was being watched by something I could not see. I reached for my cell phone. No signal, not a single bar, which was impossible along I-40. The towers lined the highway like sentries, always there, but now they had vanished, leaving me cut off from the world. "Don't bother with the phone," the voice said, suddenly closer, almost inside the cab with me. "No one can help you now. You see, I've been waiting for someone like you. Someone who drives alone, someone who won't be missed for a few days if something were to happen." I pressed my foot to the accelerator, the Peterbilt roaring as the speedometer climbed. 80 miles an hour on snow and ice was reckless, but fear has a way of silencing reason. I needed light, people, the safety of a truck stop. I needed to be anywhere but alone with that voice. Yet the voice followed, calm, knowing, whispering every detail of my panic. "I can see you, Mike, your white knuckles gripping that wheel, the sweat on your brow despite the cold. Running won't help. I've been here for 27 years, ever since my rig left the road in a storm like this one, ever since I died alone in the snow. My headlights cut across the embankment ahead, and that was when I saw it. The skeletal remains of a semi lay twisted at the bottom, its cab half buried in drifts, its trailer rusted and broken. Snow clung to the wreckage like a shroud. My chest tightened. The voice spoke again, almost tender. "Do you see me now, Mike? Do you see my grave?" For a split second, the cab of that ruined truck flashed in my lights, and there, slumped in the driver's seat, was a man in a flannel shirt, a cap pulled low over lifeless eyes that glowed with the reflection of my beams. His face was pale, drawn, and yet unmistakably watching me. The radio crackled once more. 27 years I've been waiting for someone to remember. Drivers used to look out for each other. We used to honor the dead, but not anymore. You, Mike, you will remember. You will tell them. And then the radio went silent again. Not broken, not staticky, silent. The kind of silence that feels final, like the closing of a door. I drove on, the snow easing, the hours dragging. When I finally reached Oklahoma City and pulled into the truck stop, my legs trembled as I stepped down from the cab. I asked the old man at the counter if he knew of a wreck near the Texas border. He nodded solemnly. "Tommy Martinez," he said. "Good driver, rolled his rig back in '98. Died before help could reach him. That was 27 years ago this month." I never told him what I had heard, what I had seen. I didn't need to. I knew. And ever since that night, whenever I passed that stretch of road, I slow down, key the mic, and say a few words for Tommy Martinez. Sometimes, if the snow is falling and the night is quiet, I swear I hear it back. A faint whisper through the static, soft as snow on glass. The vanishing truck stop. From the testimony of Robert Hayes, truck driver. There are highways in this country that feel as though they belong to another world. By day they look ordinary, lanes stretching straight through desert plains or winding between ridges of sandstone and pine. But at night, When the stars lean close and the air sharpens, those same roads begin to feel like thresholds, like corridors between what we call reality and what waits just outside of it. I learned this lesson one November night on a run I had taken hundreds of times before, when I found myself pulling into a place that should not have existed. A place that left me questioning everything I thought I knew about time, memory, and the world we share. My name is Robert Hayes. For nearly 2 decades, I have hauled freight between Phoenix and Denver. My route is always the same: Interstate 17 north to Flagstaff, then I-40 east through New Mexico before cutting north on I-25 to Denver. I know that run as well as I know my own backyard. Every rest stop, every fuel station, every diner. I could drive it half asleep and still hit the same marks at the same hours, and over the years that routine gave me a sense of comfort. The road becomes a kind of second home when you drive it often enough. That is why what happened that night shook me so deeply, because it violated the familiarity I had built across 15 years and 300 trips. I had left Phoenix at 2 in the afternoon with a trailer of electronics bound for Denver. The day was perfect. Clear skies, mild temperatures, the desert glowing gold as the sun leaned west. By the time I reached the high country of northern Arizona, the air had cooled to a crisp clarity, and the stars above Flagstaff glittered sharp as glass. My fuel gauge sat just under a quarter, and I knew from habit that this was the time to stop. Every driver who runs that stretch knows the Pilot truck stop off exit 201. I had been fueling there for over a decade. Clean restrooms, decent prices, a big lot with plenty of space. I had probably pulled into that same stop 200 times. It was as much a landmark to me as any mountain or mile marker. But as I approached the exit, something was wrong. The big red and blue Pilot sign was gone. In its place, glowing faintly against the night, stood a smaller sign, painted in fading yellow letters: Desert Rose Truck Stop. The letters looked hand-done, the kind you might have seen back in the 70s, the paint weathered, edges flaking. I slowed, blinking at it, my mind insisting I must have misread, but the words stayed steady and my gut told me to be cautious. Still, the gauge hovered low, and instinct pushed me to pull off. After all, maybe the place had changed owners, maybe they had rebranded. It was unusual, yes, but not impossible, or so I told myself as I took the ramp. The road leading in was narrow, cracked, and worn, so unlike the wide, well-maintained entrance I remembered. Weeds jutted through the asphalt. The lights lining the lot flickered or burned out, leaving swaths of darkness. Where I expected the sprawling Pilot building, I found instead a low, flat structure with turquoise paint peeling from its walls. The design was dated, as though untouched since the 70s. The pumps were mechanical, numbers that flipped on a wheel rather than glowing digital screens. And the prices? 98 cents per gallon. Prices I hadn't seen since I was a young man just starting out. In the lot stood 8 or 10 trucks. Not the sleek, aerodynamic rigs I knew, but older models, Macs, Internationals, Kenworths, that looked 3 or 4 decades old. Their paint was dull, their chrome worn, their engines silent. I parked beside a weather-beaten Mac that might have rolled straight out of a museum. Its headlights reflected nothing but emptiness, and I realized with a prickling unease that none of the trucks had drivers visible inside. Still, I stepped down from my cab. The night air smelled of dust and old diesel, as if the place had been preserved in amber. Inside, the building was dim, lit by yellow bulbs that cast everything in an amber haze. The floor was cracked linoleum, the walls paneled in cheap wood grain. At the counter stood an elderly clerk with thick glasses, his gaze unfocused. "Fill up?" he asked in a slow, watery voice. I nodded, handed him my card. He turned it over in his hand, squinting like he had never seen one. "We only take cash here, son." That was the first moment true dread prickled in my chest. In all my years, I had never once found a truck stop that refused cards. And yet, here, in 2024, the man spoke as though it were 1986. I tried the ATM in the corner, but it was ancient, screen flickering green. It slot the wrong size for my card. When I slid it in, nothing happened. ATM's been broken since the bank closed in '87, the clerk muttered. His words echoed like a verdict. I turned away, forcing myself to breathe steady, and wandered toward the food section. What I saw chilled me deeper. Glass bottles of Coke with labels long outdated. Candy bars wrapped in designs I remembered from my childhood. Newspapers stacked neatly, the top one blaring a headline, "Challenger Shuttle Explodes." A date stamped above, January 28, 1986. My stomach twisted. This was not a rebranded truck stop. This was something else entirely. I drifted back toward the counter, trying to act normal, but my eyes scanned the room. The men seated at booths wore flannel and trucker caps, their hairstyles decades out of place. One read a paper with that same Challenger headline. Another grumbled about gas prices climbing past $1. I felt my pulse in my throat. I forced my voice calm as I asked one of them the date. He looked at me strangely, then said, "November 15th, 1986. "Feeling all right, son?" I nodded, though my knees wavered. I had not even been born in 1986. I stepped outside. My truck sat gleaming, modern and out of place among the antiques. The other rigs loomed silent, their cabs dark, their drivers nowhere. I climbed back inside, desperate to leave, but when I shifted into gear, the wheels resisted. It was as if the ground itself clung to me. My CB crackled with static, but no voice answered my calls for help. My phone showed no service. Around me, figures began to emerge, drivers, pale and vacant, stepping from the shadows of their trucks. They stared at me with eyes that looked empty, hollow, lifeless. They moved in unison, slowly approaching, their faces slack, their breath absent. Panic clawed at me, but deeper than panic came a cold realization. These were not living men, they were echoes, shadows trapped in a place cut out of time, victims, perhaps, of something terrible. I thought of the newspapers, of the clerk's hollow voice, of the way the air itself seemed too thick, too stale. The Desert Rose was not a truck stop at all. It was a snare, a memory preserved in darkness, pulling in anyone who slowed long enough to see its sign. I closed my eyes. I thought of my wife, my children, the real world of 2024. I thought of the actual pilot stop, the digital pumps, the hum of modern engines, the sound of other drivers alive and breathing. I forced every ounce of my will into remembering that reality. And then, with a lurch so sudden it almost threw me against the wheel, my truck broke free. The figures vanished. The lot shifted. When I opened my eyes, I sat beneath the glow of the pilot sign, digital numbers flashing at the pumps, modern rigs idling all around. My phone buzzed with full signal. The world had returned. I sat there for 10 minutes, shaking, unable to move. The gauge still hovered just under a quarter, exactly as it had before. I filled up, went inside, and the clerk, a young woman with a bright smile, asked how my night was going. "Has there ever been a Desert Rose here?" I asked softly. She shook her head. "Not that I know of. This pilot's been here 12 years. Before that, nothing but desert." I nodded, unable to explain. Later, at home, I searched the archives. I found it, the Desert Rose truck stop. It had burned down in 1986, November 15th. 23 people dead in the fire. Customers, staff, regulars. The cause never determined. The site left abandoned until 2012, when Pilot built their station. I stared at that date, November 15th, the very day the man inside had given me, the very day I had apparently stepped into their ghost. Even now, when I run that route, I top off in Flagstaff without hesitation. And when I pass exit 201 at night, I do not let myself glance too long at the signs. Because sometimes, just at the edge of vision, I swear I see faded yellow letters glowing against the desert sky. A promise of fuel for 98 cents a gallon. A promise I will never, ever follow again. The human cargo. From the testimony of Marcus Thompson, truck driver. The open road teaches you many lessons. Some are simple. How to manage fatigue. How to read weather through a windshield. How to feel the weight of a rig through every curve and climb. Others are darker. Things you learn only by witnessing the things people would rather keep hidden. I always thought I understood the balance between doing my job and asking too many questions. In 30 years of hauling freight, I had carried everything from chickens to tanks, and my rule was simple. Don't pry. Pick it up, deliver it, and get paid. That rule served me well, until the night it nearly cost 17 people their lives. It was a Thursday evening in September. I had just finished my rest break outside Memphis and was sipping bad coffee when the call came. A dispatcher I didn't recognize offered me a short haul to Little Rock. 4 hours on the clock, $3,000 in pay. The load was listed as medical supplies, time-censored pharmaceuticals that needed cold storage. Nothing unusual about that. I'd hauled medicine before. The instructions were blunt. Hook up the sealed trailer, don't open it under any circumstances, and deliver before dawn. For the money they offered, I didn't ask further questions. That was my first mistake. The pickup point was a warehouse at the edge of Memphis, tucked into a district of abandoned buildings and broken lights. A single guard waited at the gate, his face unreadable beneath the glow of a cigarette. The trailer stood ready, a white 53-footer humming with the steady rhythm of its refrigeration unit. The paperwork was sparse, no itemized manifest, just the words medical supply. He handed me a business card with only a number. If there's an issue, call this. Don't call anyone else, he said flatly. His eyes lingered too long, as if measuring whether I was the kind of man who followed rules without question. I hooked up, checked the seals, and rolled out. The night was quiet, the road empty. For an hour, everything felt normal. The reefer unit purred, my gauges were steady, and the miles slipped by. Then came the sound. At first, just a faint scratching from the trailer, like something shifting. Cargo settles, I told myself. But the scratching grew rhythmic, deliberate. Then came the banging. Sharp metallic strikes against the walls, and then, beneath it all, the voices. Faint, muffled, frantic, high-pitched cries that clawed through the insulated walls. My chest tightened. These were not the noises of shifting cargo or restless animals. They were the sounds of people. I pulled to the shoulder, engine idling, heart pounding. I stepped down into the night, the hum of the reefer louder here, the banging more distinct. Pressing my ear to the metal, I heard it clearly. Desperate voices, overlapping, begging. A child's thin wail, a woman's ragged sob, a man's voice shouting words I couldn't catch. My hands shook. Against my better judgment, I dialed the number on the card. The line clicked instantly, as though someone had been waiting. "Is there a problem with the delivery?" the voice asked. Calm, too calm. I stammered out what I was hearing, scratching, voices, banging. The voice didn't hesitate. "Those are primates," he said smoothly. "Medical test subjects, perfectly legal. They panic during transport, but it is harmless. Keep driving, do not interfere." His explanation was neat, practiced, meant to soothe, and for a moment I let it. I knew pharmaceutical research sometimes involved animals. Primates could sound eerily human in distress. Maybe that was all this was. Maybe the money was simply hazard pay for a cargo that made most drivers uncomfortable. I told myself it was plausible. I told myself I had no right to question it, and I drove on. But the noises grew worse, louder, more frantic. The voices no longer sounded like echoes of animals. They were human. Clear as daylight. A woman crying for help. A child's trembling voice calling "Mama!" My stomach turned. I gripped the wheel until my knuckles whitened. The business card felt heavy in my pocket, and the voice in my head whispered the truth I was afraid to face. There were people in that trailer, not animals, people. I lasted another hour before I broke. I pulled over, climbed down, and grabbed the bolt cutters from my toolbox. My hands trembled as I cut the lock. Every second I hesitated, the banging and cries pressed harder into me. With one final snap, the seal broke. I pulled the door. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. 17 people, chained, bruised, gaunt, their eyes wide, their faces twisted with fear and hope. Women, children, and 2 men, all trapped in that metal box, their breath turning to frost in the cold air. They stared at me like I was both their salvation and another tormentor. My throat closed. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. My voice cracked as I begged for help. The response came fast. State police, ambulances, flashing lights, the authorities swarmed the scene, pulling the victims out, wrapping them in blankets, rushing them to safety. The officers asked me endless questions, their faces grim. When the FBI arrived, the truth spilled out. This was no pharmaceutical shipment. It was human trafficking. Those 17 souls had been sold like cargo, loaded into my trailer as if they were crates of goods. If I had delivered them as instructed, they would have vanished forever into a network that treated human beings as property. The men behind it, the dispatcher, the guard, the voice on the phone, were arrested within weeks, but their victims carried scars no justice could erase. Some were reunited with families, some disappeared into the silence of shelters, all carrying the weight of what had been done to them. And me? I carried the weight of how close I had come to being their jailer, how close I had been to choosing money and reputation over humanity. I never hauled freight again. I couldn't. Every trailer I saw, every reefer unit humming in the night reminded me of that sound. The scratching, the banging, the desperate voices no one was meant to hear. Instead, I joined the fight. I trained law enforcement to spot the signs of trafficking. I spoke to drivers about the importance of questioning what seems wrong, even when the pay is good. I told them that sometimes professionalism means breaking rules. Sometimes the only delivery that matters is the one where you never reach the destination. And yet, at night, when the road is long and the cab grows quiet, I still hear them, the voices. Not frantic now, not desperate, but lingering, reminding me of the thin line between obedience and conscience. Reminding me of the night the open road forced me to choose between silence and truth. I chose truth, but too late, for the countless others who may never have been rescued, and I know that as long as there are shadows on the highways, as long as there are trucks carrying secrets, the voices will never truly fade. The Predator sedan on I-80. From the testimony of Daniel Cruz, truck driver. There are nights when the highway feels like a sanctuary. The sky stretches forever, black and infinite, the stars wheeling silently above as if to keep watch over the endless river of pavement. The hum of the engine becomes steady company, and the steady rhythm of the tires against asphalt lulls you into a fragile calm. In 18 years behind the wheel, I had grown used to this comfort, this fragile peace that comes from miles of road unbroken by worry. Yet one October night, on a quiet run across Nebraska, I learned that the road can turn from sanctuary to hunting ground in the space of a few heartbeats. I was eastbound on Interstate 80, a familiar run from Los Angeles to Chicago, with a trailer of automotive parts bound for a plant in Detroit. The day had been crisp and clear, the kind of autumn afternoon where the horizon seems to glow with gold. By the time night fell, the traffic had thinned to a trickle. I had been driving for 9 hours, and fatigue was nudging me to pull off. Regulations required a rest period, and I had long since learned to respect those rules. Fatigue kills more drivers than snowstorms or breakdowns ever will. At mile marker 247, I saw the sign for a rest area. The lights were bright, the parking lot tidy, 4 other rigs already lined up like sentries against the night. It looked safe, secure, exactly the kind of stop I trusted. I eased into a space between 2 trucks, cut the engine, and completed my log entries. The lot was quiet, the restroom building glowing under fluorescent lights, the air cool but calm. I settled in, expecting nothing more than a routine stop. But the road had other plans. Around 10 o'clock, as I finished a final check of my paperwork, headlights arced across the lot. A dark blue sedan rolled slowly through the entrance, its tires crunching against gravel. At first, I thought nothing of it. Cars often pulled into these areas, families stretching their legs, or travelers catching a quick rest. But this car did not stop. It circled the truck parking section once, then again, and then a third time. Each pass was slow, deliberate, its windows tinted too dark for me to see the driver. When it finally parked, it chose a spot angled perfectly to face the row of trucks, mine included. The engine idled, the lights stayed on, and the driver did not get out. Something prickled at the back of my neck. Instinct. 18 years of trucking had taught me to trust it. I jotted the license plate number in my notebook just in case. Still, I told myself, maybe it was nothing. Maybe the driver was lost or confused. People made strange choices on the road all the time. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and tried to rest. But at 2 in the morning, when I stirred to use the restroom, the sedan was still there, parked in a different spot now, but still angled toward the trucks, still watching. This time, the driver was outside. A man in dark clothing, average build, walking slowly between the rigs. He moved like a predator, scanning plates and markings, leaning close to peer at doors. When he noticed me watching, he froze. Then, without a word, he turned back, climbed into his car, and drove away. My pulse hammered in my throat. I stood in the cold for a long moment, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. When the sedan returned a third time, it no longer pretended. It parked further back, but through my mirrors I saw the glint of binoculars. The man was watching the trucks, patient, methodical. I picked up my phone and called 911, reporting suspicious activity. The dispatcher told me an officer would arrive within 30 minutes. But 30 minutes can be a lifetime on the highway. I wasn't willing to gamble. I started my engine, ran my checks faster than I ever had, and pulled out. For a moment, the night swallowed me, and I thought I was free. But then, in my mirrors, I saw them. The same headlights sliding onto the highway, falling in behind me. The blue sedan. At first it kept its distance, a quarter-mile back, always visible, never closing. But every time I slowed, it slowed. Every time I accelerated, it matched me. I changed lanes, and a few seconds later, so did it. There was no mistaking it now. I was being followed. My mind raced. Cargo theft, maybe. Hijacking. I'd heard of crews that targeted truckers, scouting them at rest stops before striking in isolated stretches. I had always told myself those were other drivers' stories, cautionary tales passed around like folklore. But now the hunter's gaze was fixed on me. I tried every maneuver I knew. I took an exit, looped back onto the highway. The sedan followed. I pulled into a truck stop, rolled slowly past the pumps. The sedan parked across the street, waiting. I pulled back onto the interstate, and sure enough, its headlights reappeared behind me. The pursuit stretched for hours, mile after mile across the black ribbon of Nebraska. By dawn, my nerves were frayed raw. My hands gripped the wheel too tightly, my eyes flicking to the mirrors every few seconds. I called my dispatcher, voice low and tense, explaining what was happening. He urged me to drive straight to the terminal in Des Moines, where there would be security and other drivers. I pressed on, the sun rising over fields of frost, but even in daylight the sedan remained, The man was skilled, never too close, never too far, always maintaining sight of my trailer. He was trained, I realized. This was no random stalker. This was professional surveillance. I called 911 again. The dispatcher directed me to a way station just outside Des Moines, where state police were present. I followed the instructions, my heart pounding, scanning my mirrors. The sedan was still there, closing the distance as I signaled toward the exit. But as I turned into the way station, something impossible happened. One moment the car was there. The next, it was gone. No swerve onto another road, no brake lights vanishing down an exit. Just gone, like it had dissolved into the morning air. The officers took my report seriously. They listened, wrote everything down, and assured me they would investigate. But without the car, there was little they could do in that moment. I continued to the terminal, weary but safe. I thought perhaps the ordeal was over, but weeks later, news reached me. 2 other drivers from my company reported nearly identical incidents. A dark blue sedan, circling at rest stops, then following them across state lines. The FBI became involved, and eventually, the truth came out. It was an organized hijacking ring. They scouted targets along I-80, following lone drivers with valuable loads. When the time was right, they struck. Isolated backroads, rural stretches, always when the driver was most vulnerable. 12 confirmed hijackings in 6 months. Millions of dollars in stolen cargo. Several drivers beaten. 1 nearly killed. The man in the sedan was arrested 3 weeks later. At trial, I learned that he had tailed me for more than 300 miles, waiting for the perfect opportunity. If I hadn't noticed, if I hadn't trusted my instincts, if I hadn't called for help, I might have been another victim. Another nameless statistic in a federal report. I drive differently now. I don't rest in isolated areas, no matter how safe they seem. I vary my routes, keep my eyes sharp, call the police at the first sign of trouble. Paranoia, some might call it, but I call it survival. Because the road may feel like freedom, but for men who hunt in shadows, it is the perfect trap. And the only thing standing between a driver and the darkness is vigilance. Even now, 6 months later, I sometimes catch my breath when a dark sedan slides into my mirrors at night. I watch it carefully, my pulse quickening until it turns away. The FBI agent told me predators thrive on complacency, that they wait for the moment a driver relaxes, certain nothing bad could happen to him, and that moment is when the hunter strikes. So I never relax anymore. I never assume I'm safe. Mile marker 247 taught me the truth. The most dangerous cargo a trucker can carry is not steel or electronics or machinery. It's the belief that nothing bad will happen tonight. The ghost of Maria Santos. From the testimony of Frank Rodriguez, truck driver, the road remembers everything. It remembers the triumphs, the near misses, the sunsets over wide plains, and the storms that shake your bones. But it remembers the failures most of all. Some mistakes cling to the asphalt like stains that can't be washed away, following you mile after mile. I learned that 7 years ago on a cold January night, and I've been carrying the weight of that mistake ever since. I was westbound on Interstate 10, hauling construction equipment from Houston to Phoenix. Nothing about the job seemed unusual. I had been running loads like that for nearly 3 decades. Cranes, backhoes, steel beams, always heavy, always demanding careful securement. That night, though, the weather was against me. Ice storms had rolled through Texas and New Mexico, freezing rain leaving black ice in places the eye couldn't catch. Fog settled low across the desert, swallowing headlights in a racing distance. I knew better than to push forward, but I was behind schedule, and pressure from dispatch made me ignore instincts I should have trusted. That was my second mistake of the day. The first I wouldn't realize until it was too late. Sometime past midnight, a pair of headlights appeared in my mirrors. A small car, maybe 20 miles back, keeping steady pace. At first I thought little of it. Travelers are common on I-10 even in the worst conditions. But the car wobbled, sliding back and forth across lanes. The driver was fighting the ice, overcorrecting, panic seeping into their movements. I slowed, moved left, giving space. My pulse quickened as the headlights weaved erratically. Then, with a sickening inevitability, the car spun out. Twice it rotated, tires screeching against the frozen surface, before slamming into the concrete median with brutal force. The crash echoed even over the roar of my engine. The headlights blinked out, leaving only the ghostly steam rising from the wreck. I pulled over instantly, heart pounding. Emergency kit in one hand, flashlight in the other, I ran back toward the wreck. Shards of glass glimmered across the road like ice crystals. The driver's side was crushed, the windshield spider-webbed, but through the cracked passenger window I saw her, a young woman, slumped over the wheel, blood streaking her forehead. She was breathing. Barely, but she was alive. Relief surged through me. I pulled out my phone, dialed 911, gave the location, gave the details. The dispatcher's voice was calm but wary. There had been multiple crashes, delays, and it would be 45 minutes before help could arrive. "Stay with her," she said. "Keep her warm. Keep her calm. Help is on the way." I turned back toward my rig to grab blankets, my mind racing with what I could do. And then I made the choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life, because as I walked, I glanced at the load chained to my trailer. The crane I carried was improperly secured, shortened chains, overweight. If the state police inspected it, I would face fines, suspension, maybe the end of my career. I had bent the rules to save time, and now those decisions loomed like a noose around my neck. If I stayed, the officers would see. If I stayed, they'd know. And so, standing in the freezing fog, I convinced myself that the girl would be fine, that she was breathing, that help was on the way, that my presence wasn't necessary. I told myself it was survival, of my livelihood, of my family's stability. And then, in the single worst moment of my life, I got back in my truck, started the engine, and drove away. For hours afterward, guilt clawed at me. I scoured radio reports, news feeds, anything that might confirm she was safe. Nothing came. When I delivered my load the next morning, I corrected the chains and told myself the lie again. She had survived. She was fine. She didn't need me. But the truth doesn't stay buried forever. Not on the road. Driving back through the same stretch the next day, under clearer skies, I began seeing things. At first, just patches of black ice shimmering in the corner of my vision, though the sun had melted the road dry. Then, in my mirrors, a figure. A woman, standing on the shoulder, her clothes torn, blood across her forehead, watching me as I passed. I blinked, looked again, and she was gone. 10 miles later, she reappeared, standing in the median where the crash had happened. Her eyes found me in the mirror, unblinking, accusatory. My breath caught, my grip on the wheel trembled. By the third sighting, there was no mistaking her. She stood directly in my lane, a quarter mile ahead, forcing me to slam on the brakes. Her face was pale, her neck bent at an impossible angle, her arm hanging wrong, her lips moving soundlessly. As she drew closer, I realized she was speaking. Over and over the same phrase whispered through bloodied lips. "You left me to die." I tried to restart the truck, but the engine refused to turn. My CB crackled only static, my phone showed no signal, though towers lined the desert. I was trapped, alone with her. She climbed onto my running board, pressed her face against my window, her breath fogging the glass despite the impossibility of it. With one bloodied finger, she tapped rhythmically. Tap, 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 until the word formed in smears of red across the glass. Murderer! The scream that followed was unlike anything I had ever heard. Anguish, fury, betrayal, all bound together. My ears rang with it. When silence returned, she was gone. My truck roared back to life. I drove on in silence, too shaken to turn on the radio, my heart heavy with the certainty that I had condemned her. Later, at home, I searched the archives. Her name was Maria Santos, 23 years old, a nursing student on her way home to El Paso. She had survived the initial crash, had been conscious when discovered, but had died of internal bleeding 20 minutes before help arrived. If I had stayed, if I had given warmth, comfort, pressure on her wounds, she might have lived. Instead, she died alone. The article mentioned investigators were looking for a truck driver seen nearby. They never found me, because I never came forward. Since that night, Maria has followed me. Not every trip, not every mile, but often enough that I know she is never far. Sometimes she appears in the corner of a mirror, sometimes in the reflection of a diner window. Always the same torn clothes, the same bloodied forehead, the same eyes, always the same word on glass or frost. Murderer. I tried switching routes, avoiding I-10, but it made no difference. She found me in Montana, in Florida, in the driveway of my own home in Houston. Geography meant nothing. Guilt meant everything. 3 years ago, I finally did what I should have done the night of the crash. I confessed. I walked into the El Paso Police Department, sat across from a detective, and told him everything. How I had found her alive, how I had called for help, how I had abandoned her for fear of losing my job. He listened, eyes steady but sad. The statute of limitations protected me from charges, but the truth carried its own punishment. I met her family. I wept as I told them I was sorry. I set up a scholarship in her name. Pouring my savings into it, I tried to balance the scales. But Maria doesn't care about scales. She doesn't care about apologies. She still comes. She still whispers. She still points her bloodied finger through mirrors and windows. Because she knows, and I know, that I left her to die. I no longer drive trucks. I couldn't bear the constant reminders, the endless echoes of that night. Instead, I work as a volunteer EMT, answering calls, saving who I can. I tell myself each life saved is a fragment of atonement, but no matter how many people I help, it will never erase Maria's face from the glass, her voice from the silence. Some debts cannot be repaid. Some ghosts will never forgive. The road remembers, and so does she. The Phantom Convoy, from the testimony of Paul Carter, truck driver. There is a rhythm to the highways at night, a rhythm only truckers truly know. It's not just the hum of your own engine or the hiss of the wind sliding past mirrors. It's the cadence of headlights cresting hills in the distance, the scattered chatter of voices on the CB, the sense of invisible company in the darkness. You're never fully alone out there, not usually, but one winter night in Wyoming, I discovered that sometimes the company you keep isn't alive at all. It was mid-January, bitter cold, the kind of cold that gnaws through gloves and stiffens air hoses. I was westbound on I-80, hauling a load of groceries to Salt Lake City. The run was routine, but the storm that night wasn't. The forecast had promised light flurries, but by the time I reached Rawlins, the snow was falling so thick I could barely see the reflective posts lining the highway. My wipers clawed uselessly at the windshield, clearing narrow glimpses of the endless white ahead. Even at 30 miles an hour, it felt reckless. Truckers talk about Wyoming like it's cursed in winter, and with good reason. The winds sweep across those plains unchecked, carving drifts taller than a cab. More than once, I'd seen trailers jackknife into frozen barriers, or get blown straight off the road. That night, every mile carried that same risk. My radio hissed with static, interrupted by bursts of nervous chatter. Drivers warning each other about visibility, about ice, about sliding, but somewhere near Elk Mountain, the chatter fell away. And that was when I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were a relief. 3 sets of taillights appeared through the haze, steady red beacons cutting through the snow. They moved in perfect unison, 3 rigs running nose to tail at exactly the same speed. Their glow gave me a target, something to follow through the storm. I pressed the mic, relief loosening my voice. "Eastbound convoy ahead of me. You got room for another driver in line?" Silence answered. I tried again. Nothing but static. Still, I eased closer, keeping 200 feet back. The convoy moved smooth, steady, never weaving, never faltering. In weather this bad, it was uncanny. Their speed never changed, their formation never broke. 3 trucks, like shadows cut from the same mold, plowing west through the storm as if guided by something more precise than human hands. My unease grew, but the comfort of their lights was too strong to let go. Better to follow than to face the storm alone. For miles we ran, together. My headlights bounced off the rearmost trailer, an old-style box with faded paint. I leaned forward, squinting, hoping to catch a company name, but there was none. No lettering, no markings, just a dull gray shell. I tried again on the CB, voice firmer this time. "Convoy westbound past Elk Mountain. You got your ears on?" Silence. My squelch was fine. My unit was fine. They were simply not answering. Then I noticed something worse. No spray came from their tires. The snow was falling heavy. The road was slick, yet their wheels kicked up nothing. No rooster tails of slush, no crunch of ice under treads, just silence. And in that silence, my heart stumbled. I slowed, letting the gap widen, but the 3 rigs glided on, unbroken, unwavering. Curiosity battled fear. Against my better judgment, I pressed harder on the pedal, closing distance until I could see details. The trailers looked ancient, the kind you might see in photographs from the 1950s rounded corners. Faded rivets, even the cabs seemed wrong. Squat noses, boxy frames, chrome dulled with age. My father had driven rigs like that before I was born, but these trucks, impossibly, looked pristine. Untouched by rust or wear, yet decades out of time. My mouth went dry. "What the hell?" I muttered aloud. The snow swirled, and for a moment, the lead truck's cab turned transparent, like a shadow. Through it, I could see the storm itself, the distant outlines of hills. My pulse slammed. These were not trucks. Not anymore. The realization hit me like cold water. I was following ghosts. Panic surged, but I couldn't pull away. Something in me, deeper than logic, kept me tethered. My father's stories drifted back, whispers he'd shared over coffee at dawn, stories about the phantom convoy. He claimed there were rigs that had gone down in storms, drivers lost to blizzards who never made it home, but whose trucks still rolled the interstate on winter nights. "If you ever see 3 running nose to tail in a storm," he told me once, "don't follow. They'll lead you right off the road, right to where they went down." I had laughed then, chalking it up to folklore. But now, staring at these impossible rigs, the laughter curdled in my throat. I slammed the mic again, desperation cracking my voice. "Westbound convoy, answer me!" This time, a sound came back. Not words, just a whisper. Low, hollow, stretching across the static like wind through a graveyard. It repeated, steady, chilling. "Join us. Join us." My skin crawled. I yanked the wheel right, pulling onto the shoulder. Snow thundered beneath my tires, rocking the cab. For a moment, the convoy vanished into the white. Relief swept me. Until headlights reappeared directly in front of me, they had stopped. All 3, perfectly aligned, blocking both lanes ahead. Their taillights burned crimson, brighter than any bulb should. Then, in unison, they began reversing, slowly, steadily backing toward me. I screamed aloud, slammed the gear, floored the accelerator. My rig roared, tires spinning, then caught. I shot forward, swinging hard into the opposite lane. barely squeezing past as the three shadows loomed inches away. For a fraction of a second, I looked into the cab of the nearest truck. The driver sat rigid, hands fused to the wheel, face pale as bone, eyes hollow sockets glowing faint red. His mouth moved, whispering words I couldn't hear. Then the storm swallowed them, the lights dissolving into white. I drove until dawn, until the storm broke, until my hands stopped trembling enough to unclench the wheel. When I pulled into a truck stop outside Rock Springs, the clerk asked if I'd come through Elk Mountain. "Bad night up there," he said. "Real bad. You hear about the pileup in 62? Convoy of 3 trucks lost in a blizzard. Never found the bodies. Some folks say you can still see 'em on nights like this." I nodded but said nothing, because I had seen them. Not in stories, not in old photos. I had followed their lights, heard their whispers, nearly joined their fate. Now every winter, when I hear about storms along I-80, I warn younger drivers. I tell them not to trust every taillight, not to follow every glow through the snow, because some convoys don't belong to the living. Some convoys roll only to collect the next driver too tired, too desperate, too willing to believe he's found company in the storm. And if you listen closely, in the hiss of the CB static on a snowy Wyoming night, you might hear them calling, always the same words, always the same invitation. The shadow people at the rest stop. From the testimony of an unnamed truck driver, the loneliest places in America are not the deserts or the mountains or the small towns that empty out after dusk. The loneliest places are rest stops at 3 in the morning. Those patches of concrete and fluorescent light sit like islands in seas of darkness, surrounded by nothing but the hum of the interstate and the whisper of the wind. I've stopped at hundreds of them, slept in my cab, walked across their cold pavement to stretch my legs. Most of the time they are quiet, unremarkable, forgettable. But one night on Interstate 70, somewhere between Denver and Kansas City, I discovered that some rest stops aren't empty at all. Some are occupied by things that do not belong to this world. It was early March, a mild night compared to the storms of winter. I had left Denver late in the evening, eastbound with a trailer full of produce. My schedule was tight, but fatigue crept in as the miles stretched on. The hum of the tires blurred into a lullaby, and I knew better than to push past exhaustion. The sign for a rest area appeared like an invitation. Rest area 2 miles. I flicked on my blinker, grateful for the chance to stop. The lot was nearly empty. A single sedan sat at the far end, windows fogged, and one other rig idled with curtains drawn across the sleeper berth. I pulled into a spot beneath the yellow glow of a sodium lamp, cut the engine, and let the silence settle. Only the faint buzz of the light above me and the ticking of my cooling engine broke the stillness. I leaned back, set the alarm for a 2-hour nap, and closed my eyes. But sleep never came. A sound woke me. Or maybe I never truly drifted off. A soft scrape against the pavement. Not the heavy crunch of boots, not the skitter of an animal. This was slower, deliberate, like someone dragging a shoe just out of rhythm. My eyes opened to the glow of the lamp outside. At first I saw nothing. Then movement. A figure stood just beyond the light's reach. Human-shaped, but featureless. A silhouette cut from deeper shadow. It didn't move. It simply stood there, facing my cab. I sat up, heart quickening. Maybe it was another driver stretching his legs, I thought. But even as I told myself that, unease tightened in my chest. I flicked on my headlights, flooding the lot with harsh white beams. The figure vanished. Not walked away, not turned. Vanished. My stomach dropped. I rubbed my eyes, told myself fatigue was playing tricks, and tried to lie back down. Minutes later, the scraping returned, this time 2 figures, standing closer. Both inhumanly still, their outlines wavering as if smoke made solid. I grabbed my flashlight, flung open the door, and shined the beam across the lot. Empty. Silent. Only the hum of the lamp above me, the quiet drone of the other idling rig. My breath clouded the air, though the night was not that cold. I climbed back inside, locked the doors, and sat rigid. The CB crackled, sudden and sharp. A voice broke through, low and urgent. "Driver at the rest stop, keep your doors shut." I seized the mic, my voice shaking. "Who is this?" Only static answered. I tried again. Nothing. But the warning lingered in my ears. At 3:12 a.m. I glanced at the clock and saw them again. Now there were three, standing in the exact glow of the sodium lamp. My headlights should have revealed faces, clothing, details, but there was nothing, just black silhouettes darker than night, as if they absorbed the light around them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, all facing me, not moving, not breathing, just waiting. I gripped the wheel, adrenaline flooding me. I debated starting the engine, but something in me whispered not to, as though movement would invite them closer. So I sat still, frozen, watching through the glass. Minutes crawled. The figures did not shift, did not flicker. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they stepped backward, not walked, slid, their forms thinning, dissolving, until they melted into the shadows at the edge of the lot. Dawn came slowly, painting the horizon pale blue. By the time I pulled back onto the interstate, my hands still trembled. I drove until I found a diner outside Topeka, parked and stumbled inside for coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 60s, noticed my shaking. I told her what I had seen, half laughing it off. Her expression turned solemn. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You saw them, didn't you? The shadow people." My heart stuttered. She went on. "This stretch of I-70's got stories. Drivers who stop at that rest area see figures, always at night, always watching. Some say they're the souls of those who died in accidents out there, trapped between worlds. Others say they're older than the highway, older than us. Whatever they are, they never follow past dawn. But they wait for the tired ones, the lonely ones, the ones most likely to let their guard down." I left the diner unsettled, carrying her words like an anchor in my chest. Since that night, I've never stopped at that rest area again. In fact, I avoid lonely rest stops altogether. I'll park at truck stops, fuel stations, anywhere with people and noise. Because silence invites them. Darkness feeds them. And I know, deep in my bones, that they're still out there, watching from the edges of lamplight, waiting for the next driver to shut his eyes. The loneliest places in America are rest stops at 3 in the morning, and sometimes they aren't empty at all. The stranger on the roadside. From the testimony of an unnamed truck driver. Some dangers on the highway announce themselves loudly. Jackknifed rigs, storms rolling in like walls of steel, deer leaping across your lane. Others come softly, quietly, slipping into the routine of a night drive until you realize too late that what you've encountered isn't natural at all. Of all my years behind the wheel, there's one encounter I can't explain, one that still drifts into my thoughts when the road ahead is too quiet and the night too long. It began with nothing more than a figure on the roadside, and it ended with the uneasy sense that not everyone you meet out here is meant to be met. It was late autumn, almost midnight, and I was eastbound on a lonely stretch of US 50 through Nevada, the so-called loneliest road in America. I had been driving for hours without seeing another soul, just mile after mile of dark desert, punctuated by the occasional scrub of sagebrush. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and endless, and the road shimmered silver in the moonlight. There's a peace to those drives, a meditative calm, as though the world has narrowed to nothing but your headlights and the steady rumble of the engine. I was in that state when I saw him. A man stood on the shoulder, his thumb stuck out in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. He was tall, thin, dressed in jeans and a plaid shirt, no jacket despite the chill in the air. His hair was dark, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a worn cap. At first, nothing seemed unusual. People hitch rides, even out here. But what struck me was where he stood. We were dozens of miles from the nearest town, with no cars, no lights, no signs of life in any direction. He had no pack, no water, nothing, just standing there waiting, as if he had been expecting me. I slowed instinctively, my heart divided between caution and guilt. Every trucker knows stories of hitchhikers. Some grateful and kind, others dangerous. I told myself I'd at least pull alongside, offer to call help. As my beams washed over him, he lifted his head, and for the briefest moment, our eyes met, cold, gray, hollow eyes that seemed too deep, too empty. A chill ran down my spine. Something inside me screamed not to stop. I pressed the accelerator, pulling past him. In the mirror, I saw him turn, arms still raised, face expressionless as my taillights receded into the distance. I drove on, shaking the image from my mind. 20 minutes passed, the desert unchanging. And then, ahead in the beams, I saw him again. The same man, the same plaid shirt, the same cap, standing on the shoulder, thumb extended, eyes waiting. My breath caught. I had not turned off US 50, had not seen a single road intersect. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me, yet there he was, as if the desert had folded him back into my path. This time, fear took hold. I did not slow. I gripped the wheel tight, pressed the pedal, and thundered past him. My mirrors showed nothing. No dust kicked up, no figure left behind, just darkness swallowing the road. My mouth had gone dry, and the cab suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. An hour later, it happened again. The third time. Standing at the side of the road, closer to the center line now, as though he knew I would not stop, as though he wanted to force me to notice. His face was clearer this time, pale and drawn, with a thin scar running from temple to jaw. His lips moved as I passed, forming words I could not hear. I pressed on, stomach knotted, skin prickling with cold sweat. It felt less like passing a man than passing through a loop in time, caught in some pattern I could not break. By the time the fourth sighting came, I was nearly in tears. He was waiting just before a narrow bridge, his arm lowered now, his eyes fixed directly on me. And though I should have been alone in the cab, I swear I felt breath against the back of my neck. Slow. Cold. I did not look. I couldn't. I barreled across the bridge, heart hammering, until the figure vanished once more into darkness. When I finally reached Fallon at dawn, exhausted and shaken, I parked at a diner and stumbled inside. The waitress poured me coffee, noticed my trembling hands, and asked if I was all right. I told her what I had seen, half ashamed to admit it. Her expression darkened. "You saw the walker," she whispered. She told me stories, local tales of a hitchhiker who had died on that road in the 1970s, struck by a truck after a long night of trying to get home. Drivers claimed to see him still, appearing miles apart, always the same plaid shirt and cap. Some who stopped swore he vanished from the cab before they reached town. Others never made it to town at all. "He's not looking for a ride," she said softly. "He's looking for company." I never drove US 50 at night again. If I have to run that route, I plan it for daylight, when the desert lies bare and empty beneath the sun. But still, sometimes, in the edge of my vision, I see him. A man in plaid, thumb extended, eyes hollow, waiting for someone to make the mistake of stopping. The road carries many things: freight, memories, regrets. Some loads you can unload at the next stop, Others, once picked up, you carry forever. The car in the snow. Mike Henderson had been behind the wheel of 18-wheelers for more than 15 years. In that time, he had seen nearly every kind of danger a driver could imagine. He had battled mountain passes slick with ice, fought through tornado-strength winds that rattled his trailer like a toy, and pulled long hours that left him bleary-eyed, relying on coffee and sheer stubbornness to keep moving. Yet for all of that experience, nothing had prepared him for what happened one winter night in 2019 on a lonely stretch of Interstate 80. It began like countless other trips. Mike was hauling from Chicago to Sacramento, a long, straight route across the Midwest and into the mountains. The kind of job he had run so many times that the towns and rest stops along the way felt almost like old acquaintances. He left Chicago under gray skies, his trailer loaded and his logbook fresh. Snow started to fall in Iowa, soft at first, then steadier as he crossed into Nebraska. By the time midnight passed, the flakes were drifting thick and heavy, sweeping across his windshield in ribbons of white that shimmered under the glow of his headlights. The road stretched out before him like a ribbon of nothingness. No moon lit the sky, and the land around him lay buried under snow, flat and featureless. He had been driving long enough to know the strange hypnotic trance that came when snow fell in steady curtains, the world narrowing to the circle of light thrown by his truck. It was in that hypnotic stillness, around 2 o'clock in the morning, that Mike noticed the car. At first, he barely paid attention. It was a dark sedan, visible in his mirrors, trailing him at a steady quarter-mile distance. Plenty of motorists liked to follow behind trucks in bad weather, using the larger vehicle as a guide through poor visibility. Mike had done the same thing in his personal car years ago, tucking behind a semi and letting its taillights cut a path through a storm. So when he first saw the sedan, he thought nothing of it. But the hours passed and the car never changed its behavior. It never sped up, it never slowed down, it never tried to pass, nor did it lag far behind. Always the same perfectly measured distance, as though tethered invisibly to his trailer. Mike frowned and pressed his foot down. The speedometer crept past 60, past 65, then toward 70. He knew it was too fast for the slick pavement, but curiosity and unease got the better of him. The sedan matched him exactly, holding its place as if it were a shadow tied to his truck. He eased off, letting his speed drop to 50, then down to 45. The car slowed with him, never wavering. A prickling unease rose in his chest. He flexed his fingers against the steering wheel, glancing at the mirrors again and again. The headlights of the car glared brightly, washing out any clear view of the driver. The angle was never right to see through the windshield. All Mike could make out was the vague outline of a figure, sitting unnaturally still behind the wheel. By 3 in the morning, the tension was gnawing at him. He decided to test the stranger. At the next exit, a narrow ramp leading to a small truck stop, he guided his rig off the interstate. In his mirror, he watched the sedan continue straight ahead, rolling past the exit without hesitation. Mike let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the quiet stop, parked his truck under the glow of sodium lights, and walked inside. The diner smelled of coffee and fried eggs, comforting scents that grounded him. He sat at the counter, warming his hands around a steaming mug, convincing himself that it had been nothing more than coincidence. A motorist driving west, maybe heading to the same region, pacing his speed simply by chance. But when Mike climbed back into his cab an hour later and eased back onto the highway, his blood went cold. There it was again. The sedan. Exactly the same distance behind him, headlights unwavering, as though it had never left. A chill settled deeper into him than the cold outside. For the next few hours he tried everything. Sudden lane changes, speeding up, slowing down, weaving through construction zones. Each time the sedan matched him, perfectly, without hesitation. The realization began to gnaw at his sanity. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't another tired driver using his truck as a guide. Something deliberate was happening. The night wore on, the snow falling heavier. His thoughts circled in uneasy loops. Who was in that car? What did they want? Why follow him so intently through hours of snow-choked highway? His CB radio crackled with static, the occasional voice of another trucker breaking through, but whenever Mike tried to explain what was happening, the words sounded foolish even to his own ears. A car following him. So what? Truckers were followed all the time. Yet it was more than that. It was the way the sedan moved, the way it always kept that same distance, never revealing the driver, never behaving like a normal vehicle. Near dawn, somewhere outside Wyoming, Mike pulled off again, this time into a small town called Pine Ridge. The town was little more than a gas station, a diner, and a scattering of houses huddled along the highway. He parked at the far end of the empty lot, engine idling, and waited. 10 minutes passed, 15, 20. Just as he began to hope he had shaken his pursuer, the sedan appeared at the edge of the lot. It did not enter. It simply waited, headlights burning steady, the silhouette of its driver turned in his direction. Mike's hands trembled as he grabbed the CB radio. His voice came out hoarse, unsteady. "This is Big Mike on I-80. Anybody else seeing this crazy stuff out here?" Static filled the cab. Then a voice, another trucker heading eastbound, came through. "What kind of crazy stuff you talking about, driver?" Mike tried to explain, fumbling for words. The car, the endless following, the strange behavior. The other driver chuckled, ready to dismiss it, until he said something that froze Mike's blood. "You know, that's funny you mention it. Past a dark sedan about an hour, maybe an hour and a half back. Just sitting on the side of the road like it was waiting for something. Nothing wrong with it. No hazards, no hood up. Driver just sitting there. And when I passed, I swear the guy turned his head to watch me go by." Mike stared at the sedan, still waiting at the lot entrance. His mind raced. If the car had been sitting on the roadside behind him an hour and a half earlier, how was it here, now, ahead of him, waiting? For that to be true, it would have had to leap ahead somehow, traveling faster than physics would allow, without ever passing him on the road. Unless it wasn't one car at all. Unless there were many, or worse, unless it was the same car, appearing and disappearing in ways that made no earthly sense. His stomach twisted as possibilities churned. Surveillance? Cargo thieves? Or something stranger? Something not bound by the same rules of time and distance as the rest of the world. Mike forced himself back onto the road, heading east this time, back toward the safety of the larger truck stop he had left earlier. The sedan followed. Always the same distance, always the same silhouette. When he arrived at the stop, he parked under the brightest floodlights, close to the diner window. He spoke to the manager, a grizzled man named Earl, who had worked nights there for 20 years. Earl listened carefully as Mike recounted everything, then led him to the security office. They pulled up the cameras trained on the lot. Mike's truck appeared clearly on the screen, headlights bright, engine running, but there was no sedan. No trace of it at all. Mike's breath caught in his throat. He turned toward the diner window. There, in plain view, the sedan sat in the lot, waiting, headlights glaring. Yet on the monitor, nothing. His stomach dropped further when he noticed the license plate. Or rather, the absence of one. The space where the plate should have been was smeared with mud or snow, obscured in a pattern that looked too deliberate to be chance. And in all those hours of pursuit, he realized, he had never seen its brake lights flash, never seen a turn signal, never seen the telltale gestures of a human driver at all. The trooper who arrived 30 minutes later didn't dismiss him. Instead, the officer listened with an intensity that made Mike's skin crawl. And then the trooper asked a question that changed everything. "Has anyone been asking about your route lately? Any unusual calls? Any strange messages?" It turned out Mike was not alone. Other truckers had seen similar vehicles, cars that followed for impossible distances, that seemed to appear and vanish along the interstate, always keeping the same distance, always beyond clear sight. The police had quietly collected reports, but no one had ever caught one of these cars in the act. No plates, no drivers, no evidence. That night, the trooper escorted Mike across the state line, a second patrol car joining the convoy. The sedan followed all the way, calm and steady, even with police lights blazing. But as they crossed into Colorado, the car suddenly accelerated, streaked past them both, and vanished into the pre-dawn dark. The troopers pursued, but it was gone within minutes, as though swallowed by the snow. Mike never saw the sedan again, but the memory never left him. He installed cameras on his rig, added GPS trackers his wife could monitor, and began changing his routes often, refusing to drive predictable patterns. Other drivers whispered of similar experiences, and though the official investigation went cold, the stories did not stop. Some said it was organized cargo theft. Some believed it was tied to human trafficking. Others whispered darker things, that predators used the highways as hunting grounds, and that the cars were bait, waiting for the moment a driver was alone enough, vulnerable enough, to be taken. Whatever the truth, Mike knew what he had seen. The highways are not just roads. They are corridors through dark places, where normal rules slip away, where shadows can attach themselves to you, waiting, always waiting. And sometimes, the most frightening thing isn't the storm or the long miles or the fatigue. Sometimes it is what follows just far enough behind to remind you that you are not alone. The silent passenger. Johnny Morrison had been a trucker long enough to think he had seen it all. Cross-country hauls that blurred together in memory. Nights spent parked under the lonely glow of rest stop lamps. Storms that swallowed entire highways in sheets of rain. He knew the weariness that pressed heavy on his eyelids after 12 hours of driving, the comfort of black coffee in chipped mugs, the camaraderie of voices crackling across CB radio. He had seen accidents, breakdowns, and the occasional strange thing on the road that could never quite be explained, but none of that prepared him for the night he pulled into the Hickory Creek rest area off Interstate 75. It was late, close to 11:30 p.m., when Danny finally gave in to the rules that demanded rest. Truckers lived and breathed by their logbooks, and his hours had run their course. He eased his rig off the interstate and into the dimly lit lot of Hickory Creek, a small Georgia rest area marked by a scattering of picnic tables, a vending machine shelter, and a low brick restroom building. It looked ordinary, forgettable, the sort of place drivers visited 100 times without ever recalling the details. But Danny would remember this night for the rest of his life. When he pulled in, he noticed another vehicle at the far end of the lot, a blue pickup truck, its engine running, a figure slouched in the driver's seat. Nothing unusual there. Travelers often napped in their vehicles, taking breaks from long drives. Danny paid it no mind, backed his rig into a space some 50 yards away, and set his alarm for a proper 10-hour break. For a while he slept soundly in the warm cocoon of his sleeper cab. The steady hum of his truck's auxiliary systems and the soft patter of a cooling night wrapped him in a rhythm he knew well. But at around 3 in the morning his bladder woke him. Reluctantly he slipped on his jacket and stepped out into the crisp Georgia air. As he walked across the lot toward the restroom building, he glanced at the pickup again. It hadn't moved. The driver sat exactly as before, head tilted back against the headrest. Danny slowed. Something about the stillness unsettled him. People shifted in their seats when they slept, or slumped sideways, or stirred when another person walked by. This figure hadn't budged in hours. He shook off the thought, telling himself he was being silly. He used the restroom, washed his hands, and on his way back, curiosity nudged him closer to the pickup. That was when his breath caught. The driver's eyes were open. Not sleepy, half-lidded eyes, but wide, staring eyes that fixed on nothing, glassy and unblinking. His face was slack, expressionless, his arms resting limp at his sides. The sight sent a chill crawling down Danny's spine. He hesitated, then called out softly, "Hey, you all right over there?" No response. He stepped a little closer, raising his voice. "Sir, you okay?" Still nothing. Not a twitch, not a blink, just that vacant stare. Danny's first instinct was to grab his phone and call 911, thinking maybe the man was in medical distress. But when he drew closer, another detail froze him. The engine was still running. The dashboard lights glowed faintly green. Why would someone be unconscious, or worse, yet leave the engine idling for hours? He approached the driver's side window, heart thudding in his chest. As he leaned in, the man's head turned toward him, slowly, mechanically. The movement stretched out over long seconds, so unnatural that Danny felt his stomach knot. Their eyes met, and for a moment he nearly stumbled backward. The man looked through him, not at him, but through him, as if Danny were no more than smoke or a shadow. His lips parted, opening just slightly, but no sound came out. Then one trembling hand rose, pressing against the inside of the glass. The palm quivered violently, while the rest of the body stayed eerily still. Danny staggered back, a sour chemical smell rising in the air. It was sweet, artificial, almost cloying, mingled with something rotten, like spoiled fruit left in the sun. Even through the closed window, the stench burned his throat. He retreated to his truck, fumbling for his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker," he called, voice shaking. "Anyone else parked at Hickory Creek, mile marker 317? You see that blue pickup at the end of the lot?" The voice answered at once, another trucker across the lot. "Yeah, I'm here. What pickup you talking about?" Danny frowned. The blue pickup. Been sitting there for hours. Driver's inside, eyes wide open, you can't miss it. A pause. Then the other trucker said, "Driver, there's nothing there. Just empty spaces between us." Danny gripped the mic tighter. He looked through his windshield. The blue pickup was clear as day, its headlights off but cabin lights faint, the man's pale face visible even from here. "You telling me you don't see that truck?" he demanded. "Brother," the other voice replied, concerned now, "ain't nothing there. You sure you're all right? Maybe you need some coffee." Danny's hands trembled. He lifted his binoculars, stared across the lot. The truck was still there, solid, undeniable. He saw the man inside move his finger, slowly tracing letters on the fogged passenger window. From Danny's perspective, the letters were backward, but clear enough. H-E-L-P. Against every instinct urging him to stay put, Danny grabbed his flashlight and approached again. The closer he got, the stronger the chemical odor became, sharp enough to sting his eyes. The man inside was drenched in sweat, his gray shirt soaked through, his breath fogging the glass. His lips worked frantically, mouthing words Danny could not hear. He shook his head violently when Danny pointed toward the door handle, as though warning him not to open it. Then he pointed down, toward the dash, and drew a finger across his throat in a desperate gesture. Danny's stomach lurched. He circled the truck, shining his flashlight. The license plate caught his eye, Michigan tags, but the registration sticker had expired 3 years ago. The inspection tag on the windshield was equally out of date, and the vehicle itself? Rust spots, faded paint, tires worn slick, looked like it had been neglected for years, though Danny could have sworn when he first pulled in that it had looked newer. His phone showed no signal, not a bar, though he had made calls from this stretch of road countless times. He tried walking toward the restroom, holding his phone high, but the dead zone held. When he turned back, his heart nearly stopped. The truck was gone. The space where his sat was empty. No headlights, no figure, no vehicle. Not even tire marks in the damp asphalt. Where the truck should have been, the ground was oddly dry, as though untouched by the night dew. It was as if the pickup had never been there at all. Danny spent the rest of the night locked in his cab, wide awake, staring into the darkness. At dawn, other drivers began to arrive, their rigs filling the lot with noise and motion. Danny asked each of them if they had seen a blue pickup. None had. One older trucker studied him with a strange look, then asked quietly, "You ever hear about the Hickory Creek incident?" The story spilled out. 3 years earlier, a man named Robert Finch had been found dead in his blue pickup truck at this very rest stop. The cause of death? Poisoning by industrial chemicals. But Finch hadn't just been found once. Witnesses claimed to have seen his truck for days after his death, parked in lots along I-75, the driver sitting motionless inside. The official line was mistaken identity, but among truckers, the whispers were different. They said Robert Finch was still there, caught in some terrible loop, trying to beg for help he could never receive. Danny never took that route again. He switched companies eventually, requested transfers that kept him far from Georgia, far from Hickory Creek. But the memory never left him, the eyes staring blankly, the hand pressed against the glass, the silent plea scrawled backward across the window. Truckers sometimes say the road remembers, that tragedies leave imprints, replaying themselves for anyone unlucky enough to pass at the wrong moment. Danny came to believe it. The road was haunted, not just by ghosts, but by memories too strong to fade, too desperate to let go. And sometimes, those memories reach out, begging for the living to notice them. On lonely nights, when he parks under the neon glow of a truck stop far from home, Danny still thinks about the man in the blue pickup, the way he mouthed words with no sound, the terror in his wide-open eyes, and he wonders how many other drivers, pulling into rest areas across the country, have seen the same truck idling silently at the far end of the lot, waiting for help that will never come. The endless loop. Tom Bradley had always found comfort in the chatter of the CB radio. To most people, the low crackle of static punctuated by gruff voices might sound like meaningless noise, but to truckers, it was companionship on the loneliest of nights. A lifeline of words stretching across the dark, carrying weather warnings, jokes, or simply the reassurance that someone else was awake and rolling down the same long road. By 2018, Tom had been hauling freight across the Midwest for more than a decade. He had endured enough silent nights to know how heavy the cab could feel when only the drone of the engine kept him company. That was why, on a cold March evening, somewhere on I-76 between Sterling, Colorado and the Nebraska border, he reached for his radio out of habit. The road was empty, a black ribbon under the winter stars, his headlights the only light for miles. His eyelids were heavy, his body yearning for sleep, and he needed a voice, any voice, to tether him to the waking world. The radio crackled, and at first he thought it was nothing more than atmospheric noise, but then he heard it. A voice, clear and professional, speaking as though it were addressing another trucker nearby. "Eastbound Kenworth, you got your ears on?" Tom glanced in his mirrors. The road stretched silent and bare. Not a single headlight glowed behind him, no taillights ahead. Still he heard the response, a younger voice, faintly southern, calm and easy. "Yeah, I copy you, driver." "This is the Blue Pete, heading toward Denver." Tom's brow furrowed. He hadn't seen a truck in either direction for over an hour. Yet here were two voices, chatting as though they were only a mile apart. He keyed his mic, his own voice loud in the quiet cab. "This is Big Tom on the red Freightliner. Where you boys at?" Don't see anybody else out here tonight. Silence. The two voices ignored him completely, slipping back into their conversation as though he hadn't spoken. They talked about road conditions, upcoming construction, detours, and way stations. Everything about the cadence was normal. It was the kind of routine chatter he had heard 1,000 times, but there was something off. Subtle. Unsettling. They mentioned a construction zone on I-80 that Tom knew had been finished months ago. They warned each other about a way station in Kansas that had closed the year before. Their words fell out of time like echoes from a conversation recorded in the past. He let it play out, frowning, until something stranger still happened. After 23 minutes, the dialogue repeated, word for word, the same greeting, the same road reports, the same outdated details. Tom timed it carefully, and each loop began with perfect precision. He had stumbled onto a recording, a ghost of a conversation circling endlessly on Channel 19. When he stopped for fuel near Big Springs, Nebraska, he asked the clerk about it. The man's tired eyes narrowed, and his voice lowered. You heard them too, huh? The voices. Always the same two guys. Same loop. Been going on a couple years now. Always between Sterling and here. Always between midnight and 4. Tom felt a shiver crawl down his spine. The clerk leaned closer. We even found their names. Jake Morrison and Eddie Valdez. They were real truckers. Died in a crash back in 2016. Black ice. Mile marker 165. Kenworth and a Pete. Head-on collision. Tom didn't want to believe it, but the details were too precise. He shook it off, convinced there had to be an explanation. Maybe a pirate transmitter, maybe a prank. Radios could do strange things on the open plains. Signals bounced, refracted, sometimes carried conversations hundreds of miles. But the next night, when he drove that same stretch again, the voices returned. He was ready this time. He set his phone to record, kept detailed notes, and listened intently. And then he heard something new. Under the men's calm voices, faint in the static, came other sounds. The shriek of wind, the groan of metal bending, the shatter of glass. And then, clear as a bell, he heard his own voice. His exact words from the night before. This is Big Tom in the red Freightliner. Where you boys at? It played as part of the loop. A chill crawled across his skin. He gripped the mic tight, heart hammering. Jake, Eddie, can you hear me? The loop stopped. For a long minute, there was nothing but silence. A silence so deep that Tom could hear his own breath rasping. Then Jake's voice returned, but different this time. Urgent, strained, afraid. Who's that? Who knows our names? Tom swallowed hard. This is Tom. I'm on I-76. I can hear you. Are you okay? Eddie's voice cut in, frantic. Tom, we can't see the road. Ice. Black ice everywhere. Brakes won't hold. We're going too fast. Tom's blood went cold. He was listening to the crash unfold in real time, years after it had already happened. He tried to shout over the mic, desperate. Slow down! Pull your rigs over! You've got to stop! The voices dissolved into chaos, tires screaming, metal twisting, men crying out in terror. And then the final crunch, the sound of two lives ending in the cold black night. Tom pulled onto the shoulder, shaking so hard he could barely set the brake. He sat there in the dark, staring at the silent radio. When he keyed the mic again, the loop had returned. Calm voices, talking construction and detours, as though nothing had happened. The next day he dug deeper. He found the accident report, the news articles, the obituaries. Every detail matched. Jake Morrison, Peterbilt, Eddie Valdez, Kenworth, killed on mile marker 165 during a February storm. Witnesses had reported hearing them talking on their CBs right up until impact. The clerk had been right. Over the weeks that followed, Tom heard them again and again. Sometimes it was only the loop. Sometimes it was the cries for help. Once, a faint voice broke through the static at the end. "Tom, help us." Other truckers whispered about it too. Some claimed that after they spoke with Jake and Eddie, strange things began to happen. Near accidents, tires blowing at the worst possible time, sudden skids on ice where none should be. It was as if the dead men's desperation had bled into the present, drawing the living toward the same fate. Tom drove that stretch one last time 6 months later. He stayed just outside the zone, passing at mile marker 160. As he did, his CB came alive, Jake's voice, calm now. "Thanks for listening, Tom. We've been trying so long. Maybe now we can rest." The loop never played again. Other truckers reported silence on Channel 19. No echoes, no chatter. The highway went back to being just another road, empty and cold. But Tom never forgot the voices. On lonely nights when the static hums and fatigue pulls at his eyes, he still half expects to hear them. Jake and Eddie, caught forever in their final moments, reaching out across the airwaves, desperate to be heard. The road that led nowhere. Marcus Webb had spent 15 years behind the wheel, enough time to learn every quirk of the highways stretching between Dallas and Denver. The road was as familiar to him as the back of his own hand. He could picture the exits before they appeared, knew which rest areas had the best coffee, and could practically navigate the long haul in his sleep. But on a foggy October night in 2019, the road he thought he knew best betrayed him. The fog had been thick for hours, rolling over the Oklahoma plains like a ghostly tide. His headlights barely reached 50 feet ahead, and the world outside his cab had been reduced to a shifting gray curtain. He trusted his GPS more than his eyes, watching its glowing map show a reassuring line heading north along I-35. He kept to the right lane, steady at 45 miles an hour, the engine humming like a lullaby. Then the GPS spoke, calm and precise, recalculating. "Take the next exit." Marcus frowned. There was no reason for a detour. He had driven this stretch dozens of times. There were no closures, no construction projects that he knew of. Still, GPS systems updated constantly, and accidents could happen at any time. He reasoned it was safer to follow the directions than risk missing something ahead. He eased his rig off at exit 126. The ramp led to a state highway Marcus couldn't remember ever noticing before. Yet it looked legitimate. 2 wide lanes in each direction, freshly painted lines, proper signage. The pavement gleamed black beneath his headlights, slick with moisture. The GPS assured him this road would curve him back toward Denver, adding only a handful of miles to the trip. For the first 20 minutes he felt reassured. The fog pressed close, but the road itself seemed normal. His odometer ticked steadily upward, mile markers passed, standing tall at the roadside. But after a while he realized something was off. The mile markers made no sense. He passed number 47, then 23, then 61, as if someone had planted them without logic. Some weren't even proper markers, just wooden posts spray-painted with numbers in uneven strokes. Marcus felt unease coil tight in his gut. He reached for his CB radio, hoping for another voice to cut through his nerves. Static hissed back. No voices, no chatter. Not even the distant hum of another trucker checking in. He tried his phone. No service. That wasn't unusual in rural Oklahoma, but paired with everything else, it made the night feel heavier. After an hour, he realized something worse. He hadn't seen a single rest stop, no gas stations, no diners or motels. On a road that wide and well-kept, there should have been signs of life. Instead, there was nothing but the endless fog and the curve of highway stretching into dark. That was when he noticed the other vehicles. At first, he felt relief. Headlights appeared in his mirrors, taillights ahead. But relief soured into dread. The vehicles were all older, no models newer than a decade past. They moved in eerie synchronization, each one maintaining perfect spacing. None passed, none fell behind, none exited. They simply traveled in unison, locked into lanes like pieces of a machine. Marcus tried to pass a slow-moving sedan, signaling and easing into the left lane. He pulled up alongside and glanced over. His breath hitched. The driver was staring forward, eyes wide with terror, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. His mouth moved slowly, forming a single word Marcus could read even through the fogged glass. "Hello," Marcus honked, waving frantically, trying to signal him. The man only shook his head, frantic, and pointed forward as though warning him not to stop. Marcus slowed back, letting the sedan drift ahead, and looked around. He saw the same look on other drivers' faces. Fear, confusion, a helpless, trapped stillness. His GPS continued to chirp calmly, showing him progressing toward Denver. Yet when Marcus checked his truck's clock, it told another story. He had been driving for over 6 hours since taking the exit, yet his odometer showed barely 200 miles traveled. Stranger still, his fuel gauge hadn't budged. It was as though he were driving without moving, stuck on a treadmill of asphalt and fog. Determined to escape, Marcus ignored the GPS and took the next exit he saw. The ramp wound down into the mist, leading toward what appeared to be farmland. Then, without warning, the asphalt ended, not in a barricade or a dirt road, but in a cornfield, the pavement vanishing like a line cut short. Marcus spun the wheel, heart racing, guiding his rig back toward the highway. When he reached the top of the ramp, his stomach turned to ice. The exit was gone, no break in the guardrail, no ramp, no trace of a road at all, just the endless highway, unbroken. He grabbed the CB again, desperation in his voice. "Breaker 9, anybody copy? This is Big Marcus. Anybody else stuck on this road?" For a moment, nothing. Then, faint and static-filled, a voice replied. "Breaker 9, this is Lost Leader. You on the Phantom Highway too?" Marcus nearly dropped the mic. "Phantom Highway? What are you talking about?" The voice sighed, weary, tired beyond words. "You've been driving for hours, haven't you? Seeing the same mile markers, the cars that won't stop or change lanes?" "Yes," Marcus breathed. "How long you been stuck here?" "Don't know anymore. Days, maybe weeks. Sun comes up, goes down, but the road just keeps winding, never gets anywhere." As Marcus listened, other voices joined in, faint whispers on the channel. Other truckers, other drivers, all lost. Some said they had been there a night, others swore it had been months. Their words overlapped, forming a chorus of hopelessness. One theory floated among them: the road was real, but not part of normal space. A road outside time, collecting those who turned down it. Some drivers escaped, finding themselves suddenly back on familiar pavement with only minutes gone. Others never returned. Marcus clutched the wheel, fear and exhaustion weighing him down. Then, without warning, the fog thinned. Ahead, green highway signs glowed like beacons. I-35 North, Kansas City. His GPS cheerfully announced, "Merge onto I-35 North." Emerged, and instantly everything was normal. Modern cars passed him. Gas stations and mile markers lined the road. He pulled into the first truck stop, trembling. According to his logbook, he had lost only 47 minutes. His fuel gauge showed nearly the same as before, but his body felt as though he had driven through the night. Inside, another trucker noticed his pale face. "You just come off the Phantom Highway?" the man asked casually, as if it were common. When Marcus nodded, the driver wasn't surprised. "Happens around here. About one trucker a month. Highway hypnosis, they call it. But too many of us seen the same thing. Wrong mile markers, trapped cars, CB chatter." It's real, all right. Just don't let it take you twice. Marcus never drove that route again alone. He carried extra navigation tools, double-checked every exit, and refused detours in fog. Yet he knew, deep down, that the phantom highway was still out there, waiting for another driver to take the wrong turn, to vanish into its endless loop of asphalt and fear. And the thought that chilled him most wasn't that he had escaped. It was the knowledge that others were still out there, headlights glowing faintly in the fog, driving endlessly on a road that never led home. The warehouse without a name. Rick Dawson thought it would be the easiest run of his career. His dispatcher called him at 3 in the morning with an urgent job, an emergency pickup outside Bakersfield, California. Simple load, the dispatcher said. Get it to Phoenix by noon tomorrow and you're good. Paperwork's ready, trailer's waiting. Rick didn't argue. He had driven late-night loads for years, and the thought of extra pay for an emergency run was always welcome. He threw on his jacket, climbed into his rig, and headed toward the address provided. The highways were quiet, California's farmland lying silent under the stars, and for a while the drive felt like countless others. But when he turned onto the road leading to the warehouse, a strange feeling gripped him. The building stood alone, surrounded by empty lots and rusted chain-link fences. There were no company signs, no logos, no loading dock numbers. Just a plain, gray structure, its corrugated metal sides catching faint light from a nearby street lamp. One overhead door was open, yawning like a mouth in the darkness. Rick frowned. He had picked up from hundreds of warehouses, and even the smallest ones usually had markings, numbers, logos, at least a company name posted by the gate. This place looked stripped of all identity, as though it had been built to exist without being noticed. Still, a forklift appeared, its headlights glaring, and an operator waved him back into position. The man wore plain coveralls with no company logo, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't speak, only motioned. Rick tried small talk. Weather, road conditions, the usual chatter. But the man responded with nothing more than a grunt. When Rick asked for the bill of lading, the forklift operator handed him a clipboard. The forms looked official enough, stamped and typed, but the details unsettled him. The shipper was listed as Western Distribution, the receiver Southwest Logistics. No street addresses, only P.O. boxes. Rick had seen shady paperwork before, but this was unusually vague. He glanced back at his trailer as the forklift began loading. The paperwork claimed he was hauling electronics, televisions, computers, stereo equipment, but the pallets didn't sound right when they hit the trailer floor. Electronics had a particular weight, a certain balanced density. These pallets thudded strangely, heavy in odd places, too light in others. The operator worked quickly, avoiding eye contact, and when he finished, he vanished back into the warehouse without securing the trailer. Rick sealed it himself, another red flag, but he told himself not to overthink it. A run was a run. He pulled out of the lot, glancing once in his mirrors. The overhead door slid shut, and within minutes the warehouse went dark, as if it had never been opened. The uneasy feeling clung to him as he merged onto I-5 and began climbing the grapevine. His engine strained harder than usual, fuel burning faster than it should. At the first scale he passed, his gross weight was 78,000 pounds, just under the legal limit. Yet his rig moved as though carrying much more. By sunrise, unease had hardened into dread. He pulled into a truck stop, parked under the bright canopy, and walked to the back of his trailer. The seals were unlike anything he had seen before, thick metallic strips that shimmered faintly in the light. They looked more like evidence tape than standard shipping seals. Stranger still, the numbers stamped on them didn't match the ones on his paperwork. He called his dispatcher. "Hey, something's off with this load. Seals don't match. Paperwork looks fake." There was silence on the other end, then confusion. "Rick, what pickup? I don't see anything scheduled under your name. No emergency run, no Bakersfield warehouse. Rick's stomach dropped. He repeated the address. The dispatcher put him on hold. When he returned, his voice was tense. Rick, that warehouse doesn't exist. There's nothing at that location, just an empty lot. Rick ended the call with his pulse hammering. He tried calling the number listed for the receiver in Phoenix. Disconnected. He looked up Southwest Logistics online. A website appeared, but it was generic. Stock photos, vague descriptions, no real contacts. It looked like a shell, not a business. Panic nipped at him. He was hauling 78,000 pounds of cargo he couldn't identify, with paperwork tied to companies that didn't exist. If he got stopped at a way station or pulled over by DOT, how would he explain any of it? Against every instinct, he decided to break the seals. He cut one carefully, peeled back the metallic strip, and swung the doors open. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. The pallets were wrapped in black plastic, thicker than normal shipping wrap. Underneath, he could see shapes that didn't match electronics at all. Some were long and narrow, others curved in unnatural ways. He pressed against the plastic. It gave slightly, not rigid like metal or plastic, but soft, yielding, organic. The smell hit him next. It wasn't decay, not exactly, but something primal and nauseating, like chemicals mixed with something faintly alive. It made him gag and stumble back, covering his nose. His body screamed at him to close the doors, to pretend he had never looked. Shaking, he resealed the trailer as best he could and called Highway Patrol. A trooper arrived, skeptical but professional, and asked to see the cargo. Together, they opened the trailer. Rick's stomach flipped. The pallets were gone. The trailer was nearly empty, holding only a few old televisions and monitors stacked haphazardly. They looked like junk, pulled from storage years ago, nothing like what Rick had seen minutes earlier. The officer raised an eyebrow. "This what you called us out for? Some used electronics?" Rick tried to explain. The strange warehouse, the fake paperwork, the unnatural pallets. But with nothing to show, his words sounded insane. The officer ran the paperwork. Everything checked out. The bill of lading listed real companies this time, with working phone numbers. The seals matched the manifest. Rick stood in the lot, trembling. The officer gave him a wary look before sending him on his way. At the Phoenix delivery dock, workers unloaded the electronics without question. They scanned his papers, nodded, and signed off. Everything looked normal. Rick asked them about the sender, about Western distribution. They looked confused. "Been working with them for years. Good company. Why do you ask?" Rick signed the papers, climbed back into his cab, and drove away. But nothing felt normal. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had touched through that black plastic. Back home, he researched the warehouse again. This time, satellite maps showed the lot had been abandoned for years. The last company to operate there had been shut down by federal investigators, its reasons sealed from public record. Even more chilling, he found forum threads. Other truckers told similar stories. Emergency loads picked up from nameless warehouses. Paperwork that seemed fake, only to check out later. Cargo that looked one way during transit, but changed by delivery. Some claimed their trailers emptied completely, only for receivers to sign paperwork as though everything had arrived perfectly. The whispers suggested a hidden network operating in the shadows of the industry, using truckers as unknowing couriers for things that weren't meant to exist in records. A parallel system of logistics, seamless and invisible. Rick stopped taking emergency runs after that. He verified every pickup, every receiver, double-checking addresses before agreeing. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling. His trailer had carried something impossible that night, and reality itself had shifted to cover it up. The highways were vast, millions of miles of cargo flowing each day. It would be the perfect cover for shipments too dangerous, too strange, or too secret to appear on paper. Rick suspected he had stumbled into one of those shipments, and though the load had vanished from his trailer, he knew it hadn't vanished from the world. Somewhere out there, it was still moving, and someone had made sure he would never prove he had seen it. The stop that wasn't there. Calvin Moore had been driving trucks for almost 20 years, and in that time, he'd built a kind of sixth sense for the road. He knew when fatigue was about to hit him, when storms were gathering beyond the horizon, and when it was smarter to pull over rather than press on. But nothing in his years of experience prepared him for the night he stumbled upon a truck stop that shouldn't have existed. It was the summer of 2017, and Calvin was cutting across Nevada on a long, lonely haul from Salt Lake City to Reno. The desert night stretched out around him in a vast emptiness, broken only by the occasional glow of distant casino towns and the steady line of headlights from the rare vehicle passing in the opposite lane. The CB radio was quiet, and his phone had long since lost service. By 2 a.m, his eyes burned with fatigue. He had been driving for nearly 11 hours straight, and he promised himself he would pull into the next truck stop to rest. His logbook was close to its legal limit, and he could feel the drowsiness pressing against him like a heavy blanket. That was when he saw the sign. Next exit dot, Desert Star Truck Stop. Fuel, food, showers. The glowing letters rose out of the darkness like salvation. He didn't remember ever stopping at a place called Desert Star, but Nevada's highways were dotted with dozens of small, family-run stops that came and went over the years. He turned on his blinker and took the exit gratefully. The ramp curved down into a wide gravel lot lit by towering halogen lamps. The truck stop looked ordinary enough at first glance. A gas canopy with half a dozen pumps, a convenience store with a flickering neon open sign, and a small diner tacked onto the side. A line of rigs sat parked in neat rows, their marker lights glowing faintly in the night. Calvin parked at the far end, killed his engine, and stepped down into the warm desert air. Something felt off. The silence was absolute. Normally, truck stops had a low background hum, engines idling, air brakes hissing, voices muttering. Here there was nothing, not even the sound of insects or wind. The stillness pressed on his ears until he found himself holding his breath. He walked toward the store, boots crunching on gravel. The neon sign above the door buzzed faintly, but when he entered, the place seemed frozen in time. The shelves were lined with dusty products, chips, candy bars, motor oil, but all of them looked strangely outdated. The packaging had styles he hadn't seen in years. A stack of soda cans bore logos from the 1990s. The cashier sat behind the counter, a middle-aged man with slick-back hair and a red vest. He looked up at Calvin with a polite smile. "Evening driver? Long haul tonight?" Calvin nodded, unsettled by the man's stiff movements, almost as though he were acting out a script. "Yeah. Just need coffee and a place to rest for a bit." The cashier gestured to the diner. "Coffee's hot. Showers are clean. Take whatever you need." Calvin poured himself a cup of coffee from the glass pot sitting on the warmer. The smell was weak, stale, but familiar enough. He sat at a booth in the diner's section, sipping slowly. Around him, other drivers sat at tables, but none of them moved. They stared at their food, forks in hand, as if caught mid-bite. One man's eyes were open wide, his lips parted slightly, but he didn't blink. A shiver worked down Calvin's spine. He cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Evening, fellas," he said softly. No one responded. The clock above the counter ticked steadily, but when Calvin looked closer, the second hand wasn't moving. He pushed his cup away and stood. His nerves screamed at him to leave, but when he stepped back outside, his truck was gone. Panic hit him like ice water. He had parked on the far edge, next to a white Kenworth. Now the entire row was empty. No rigs, no cars, nothing. The gravel lot stretched wide and bare under the halogen lamps. He spun, searching frantically. The pumps were still there. The store still glowed faintly. But every vehicle was gone. Even the highway beyond the lot seemed darker, emptier, as if it had been erased. He stumbled back inside, demanding answers. But the cashier was gone. The booths were empty. The frozen drivers had vanished as though they'd never existed. The entire stop was silent. Calvin's heart pounded. He ran to the payphone mounted on the wall. He lifted the receiver. It was cold, heavier than it should have been, and pressed it to his ear. Instead of a dial tone, he heard voices, dozens of them, overlapping, whispering. Some were truckers calling their routes. Others were frantic cries for help. One voice repeated over and over, "Don't stop, don't stop, don't stop." He dropped the receiver, backing away. His reflection in the store's front glass caught his eye. For a split second, it wasn't his own face staring back. It was older, gaunt, with eyes sunken deep into shadow. Then it blinked, and the image was gone. Calvin bolted through the door, running across the gravel lot. He didn't know where he was running to, only that he had to get out. The halogen lamps above flickered, one by one, until the lot was plunged into darkness. The glowing highway exit sign in the distance winked out like a candle. He stumbled, falling to his knees. When he looked up, he was back behind the wheel of his truck. The desert highway stretched before him, endless and empty. His GPS showed he was still on I-80, 30 miles west of Elko. His clock read 2:47 AYEM, the exact time he had taken the Desert Star exit. Except there had been no exit signs, nothing but uninterrupted desert. Calvin never told his dispatcher the full story. He only said he'd had a close call with fatigue and pulled off for a quick nap, but deep down, he knew what he had experienced wasn't just a trick of exhaustion. Later, talking with other drivers, he heard the whispers. Some had seen it too, the Desert Star truck stop, glowing out of the desert night, welcoming the weary. Some described the frozen diners, the outdated products, the silence. Others claimed they had stopped for fuel, only to discover their tanks empty once they returned to the highway. Truckers called it a mirage made solid, a trap waiting for drivers desperate for rest. A place that seemed to exist only when you were too tired to question it. Some said it was a leftover of old highways, a ghost stop repeating itself like a scar burned into the land. Others swore it was something hungrier, luring travelers off the road to feed on their time, their sanity, maybe even more. Calvin avoided Nevada for years after that night. He rerouted loads, refused dispatches, and carried extra fuel to avoid night runs across the desert. But sometimes, late at night, he still sees the glow of halogen lamps on the horizon, shimmering in the heat haze of memory. And every time he presses the accelerator just a little harder, praying he never sees the Desert Star truck stop again. The driver in the glass. James Walker had never been afraid of his own reflection. In truth, he'd always been comforted by mirrors. Growing up in rural Kansas, he'd often sit in front of his bathroom mirror as a boy, making faces, pretending he was talking to another version of himself. In the long hours of trucking life, he'd grown used to glimpses of his face in rearview mirrors, in polished diner windows, even in the chrome finish of other rigs. It was a kind of constant companion on the road, proof that he was still present, still alive, still him. But one late night in Wyoming, James discovered that sometimes a reflection wasn't simply a reflection. It was early winter, a thin layer of snow dusting the shoulders of I-25 as he hauled a refrigerated load south toward Cheyenne. The night was crisp, the stars brilliant, the kind of sky that made the whole world feel endless. His cab was warm, the hum of the engine steady, and he had the radio tuned low. Around 1 o'clock IEM, James noticed something odd. A rig appeared behind him in the mirror. At first, nothing unusual at that hour, though his paranoia grew by a little while still hovering around that unfriendly universe. Its highlights glowed bright, catching the edges of his trailer. But as the minutes ticked by, James frowned. The truck wasn't gaining. It wasn't falling back. It kept the exact same distance no matter how he adjusted his speed. When the road widened briefly into 3 lanes, the truck shifted left, pulling alongside. James turned to glance at it and froze. It was his truck. Same model, same white paint, same trailer number stenciled on the side. The mud splatters on the fenders, the faded company decal, everything was identical. Even the small crack in the driver's side mirror. The one he kept meaning to fix was there. And in the driver's seat, lit faintly by the dashboard glow, was himself. The man looked exactly like James. Same square jaw, same baseball cap, same set of tired eyes. For a moment, James thought it must be a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But then, the doppelganger turned his head. Their eyes locked across the lanes. James's stomach lurched. The other James smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a slow, deliberate curling of the lips, stretched too wide, too knowing. Panic surged. James stomped the accelerator, his rig groaning as it picked up speed. The doppelganger truck matched him instantly, staying perfectly parallel. Their trailers thundered side by side, tires hissing on cold asphalt, engines roaring in harmony. James gripped the wheel tighter, sweat beading on his forehead. He yanked his CB mic off the dash. "Breaker, breaker, anybody got eyes on I-25 southbound? You seeing this?" Static. Then, faintly, a voice answered. "What are you running from, James?" It was his own voice. He dropped the mic, heart hammering. His double turned again, eyes gleaming in the faint glow, and mouthed words James couldn't hear. Desperate, James glanced forward and saw lights ahead. A rest area. He swerved toward the exit, tires screaming, pulling hard onto the ramp. When he looked back, the other truck was gone. The lot was nearly empty. A few cars idled under sodium lights, their windows fogged. James parked crooked, engine idling, and sat shaking for nearly 10 minutes before he dared step out. He circled his rig slowly, checking every inch, half expecting to find a second truck parked nearby. But the night was still. The only sound was wind sweeping across the barren hills. Back inside, he wiped his face with trembling hands. Maybe it was stress, maybe it was fatigue, yet something inside him knew better. Over the following weeks, it happened again, always on long, lonely stretches of road. His doppelganger would appear in mirrors, first distant, then closer, always driving perfectly in sync. Sometimes James saw him in the passenger window as if seated beside him. Once, he glimpsed the double in his side mirror, but the expression was wrong, the eyes burning with anger that wasn't his. Other truckers had stories too. He heard whispers at diners and fuel stops. Ever see your own rig out there? Ever catch yourself driving it? One man swore he chased his double for 60 miles before it vanished into thin air. Another said his mirror self waved, then veered into oncoming traffic, leaving nothing behind but skid marks. James began to dread his own reflection. He covered his cab mirrors with tape when parked. He avoided looking at chrome or glass, yet he couldn't escape. A driver lives with mirrors. They are survival tools, extensions of his eyes. And every time James glanced, he feared who might be staring back. One night near Pueblo, the double appeared again. This time it was closer, too close. James could see every detail of the cab, right down to the empty coffee cup sitting in the holder. His reflection self lifted a hand slowly and pressed it to the glass. palm out. James's own hand twitched on the wheel, compelled to mirror the gesture. Against his will, he found himself lifting his hand, pressing it against his own window. For a heartbeat, it felt like there was only a thin sheet of glass between them, not the lanes of highway. Then the double leaned closer, lips moving. James heard the words inside his skull, not through his ears. Switch. Terrified, James slammed on the brakes, dropping back until the other rig faded into darkness. When he finally pulled into a crowded rest stop, he sat in the driver's seat for hours, refusing to sleep, certain that if he closed his eyes he would wake up in the wrong cab, living the wrong life. Some say the mirror trucks are omens, that seeing your own double on the road means your death is near. Others claim they are echoes from parallel highways and parallel worlds, bleeding through at weak spots. A few whisper darker things, that the doubles aren't echoes at all, but hunters, waiting for the chance to take the place of the men they mimic. James doesn't know which is true, but even now, years later, he still drives with unease. He avoids the stretch of I-25 where he first saw his twin. He covers mirrors at night when parked, and when headlights glow in his side glass, his breath catches, waiting to see if it's only another driver or the same face he sees in the mirror every morning, smiling back at him with intentions he cannot understand. Because the scariest thought is not that your reflection isn't real, it's that it wants to be. Mile marker in reverse. Harold Jennings had been driving trucks for more than 30 years, long enough to see the interstate system evolve like a living creature. Exits appeared, ramps expanded, small towns grew into sprawling logistics hubs. He liked to joke that he had driven the same stretches so often he could spot when a new sign went up just by feel. But one spring night in 2020, on a quiet run across New Mexico, Harold encountered something he couldn't explain, a stretch of road that seemed to run backward through time. It started innocently enough. He was running east along I-40, hauling produce out of California toward Dallas. The night was calm, the desert cool, the stars sharp overhead. He felt good. Not overly tired, not pushing the hours. Around midnight, he passed mile marker 212. He noted it out of habit. Then, a few minutes later, he saw mile marker 211. At first, he thought nothing of it. Numbers can blur when you've been on the road too long. But then came 210, then 209. He frowned, leaning forward in his seat. Markers were supposed to count up, not down. Not on this stretch of highway. He checked his GPS. The glowing line still showed him moving east. His odometer climbed as normal. Yet every few minutes another marker appeared, dot lower than the last. He keyed the CB. Breaker 19, any eastbound drivers around marker 28? You boys seeing these signs backwards? Or am I losing it? Silence. He tried again. More silence, except for faint static that almost sounded like breathing. Unease coiled in his gut. He told himself it was a prank. Maybe some local kids had flipped the signs. But the farther he drove, the more convincing it became. The markers counted steadily downward. 207, 206, 205. The desert around him seemed to change too. Buildings he swore had been there last month were gone. A rest area he remembered using looked abandoned, its lights dark, the canopy rusting. The highway itself grew narrower, the pavement more cracked, as though he were slipping backward into an earlier decade. Then he saw headlights ahead. Dash another truck, westbound. Relief swept through him. He slowed, flashing his brights in greeting. The other truck did the same. As they passed, Harold glanced at the driver. His blood ran cold. The man behind the wheel looked exactly like him. Older, thinner, his hair gray and sparse. His face carried years. Harold hadn't yet lived. but the resemblance was unmistakable. Their eyes met across the dark, and the older Harold lifted a hand slowly from the wheel, as though in warning. The sight nearly made Harold swerve. His grip tightened on the wheel, his heart slamming against his ribs. He blinked hard, looked back in the mirror, but the other truck was gone, vanished, as though swallowed by the night. He pressed the accelerator, desperate to reach the next exit, to find some anchor of reality. The markers continued to fall. 199, 198, 197. The desert blurred by, shapeless under the moon. Then came the voice, playful, crackling through his sea-bead, low and rough. "Turn around." Harold snatched the mic, his voice hoarse. "Who is this?" No answer, only static. Then, again clearer, "Turn around, don't go farther." He recognized the voice. It was his own. Panic clawed through him. He fought the urge to slam the brakes, to abandon the road altogether. Instead, he kept going, mile after mile, watching the numbers drop. At 190, he saw another rest area. This one intact, bright lights glowing, vending machines humming. He pulled in fast, parked under a lamp, and sat, trembling. The lot was empty. No cars, no trucks, just his rig. When he stepped out, the air smelled different. Sharper, cleaner, like the desert after a storm. He walked to the restroom building. Inside, the tiles were spotless, the mirrors shining. He splashed water on his face, trying to ground himself. When he looked up, his reflection wasn't right. It was him, but older. The same man he'd seen on the highway. This time, the reflection spoke. "You don't want to know what's waiting if you keep going." Harold stumbled back, heart pounding. His lips moved, but no sound came. The reflection leaned closer, eyes heavy with sorrow. "I've been where you're heading. Don't make the same mistake. Get off this road before the numbers run out." The lights flickered. When Harold looked again, the reflection was normal, just his tired, middle-aged face staring back. He bolted for his truck, fired the engine, and turned around. The moment he merged westbound, the markers corrected themselves. 191, 192, 193. The road widened, smoothing beneath his tires. The abandoned rest stop he had seen earlier stood fully lit, modern. Within minutes, everything was back to normal. He never spoke of it to dispatch, he never told his wife, but among truckers, he shared it quietly. Some nodded knowingly, a few admitted they had seen something similar. Mile markers in reverse, roads that seemed to run back through the years. Encounters with older versions of themselves. Theories circulated. Some said the road itself was a thin spot, a seam in time where past and present overlapped. Others believed it was a warning, glimpses of the future meant to steer them away from choices not yet made. A few whispered that if you ignored the signs, if you let the markers count all the way down to zero, you wouldn't come back at all. Harold never tested it. He avoided that stretch whenever possible. And on nights when the desert is too quiet, he remembers the look in his older self's eyes, weary, sorrowful, filled with knowledge he didn't want to carry. Because the scariest thing about seeing yourself on the road isn't realizing you might be heading into danger. It's realizing that the one warning you'll trust the least is your own. The hitchhiker by the overpass. Lionel Cruz wasn't the kind of man who scared easily. After 2 decades of long-haul trucking, he had dealt with just about every danger the road could throw at him. Sudden storms, icy mountain passes, engine breakdowns in the middle of nowhere, and more than a few close calls with reckless drivers. But there was something about the emptiness of night highways that always unsettled him. It wasn't the traffic or the weather that put him on edge. It was the moments of stillness, when the road seemed too quiet, when the world outside the windshield felt more like a dream than a place you could touch. It was on such a night in 2015, driving east through Missouri, that Lionel encountered the hitchhiker under the overpass. The evening had been ordinary. His trailer was loaded with appliances bound for Nashville, and he had left Kansas City just before dusk. By midnight, the highway was nearly empty, a thin strip of asphalt stretching endlessly under the glow of his headlights. The radio was low, the coffee in his thermos lukewarm, and the miles passed in steady rhythm. Then, just past mile marker 142, he saw the overpass, and beneath it, standing at the edge of the road, was a man. That wasn't unusual in itself. Lionel had seen plenty of hitchhikers over the years, but something about this one caught his attention immediately. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, his face hidden by the shadow of the bridge. He wasn't holding a sign, wasn't sticking out a thumb, wasn't doing anything at all to flag a ride. Just standing, waiting. As Lionel's truck drew closer, the man stepped forward. His features came into view in the sweep of the headlights. Gaunt, pale, with eyes that seemed too wide, reflecting light in a way that made Lionel's stomach twist. The man raised his hand, not in the classic hitchhiker's gesture, but slowly, like a wave meant for Lionel and Lionel alone. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving. He gripped the wheel tighter, foot pressing harder on the accelerator. The man's eyes followed him as he passed, his head turning unnaturally far, watching Lionel's rig until it disappeared into the night. Lionel shook his head, muttering to himself. Fatigue, maybe, his mind playing tricks, but 10 minutes later another overpass loomed ahead. And there he was again. Same man, same pale face, same wide eyes. Lionel's chest tightened. He swore out loud, convinced it had to be a coincidence. Maybe a twin, maybe someone playing a prank. But the farther he drove, the less sense it made. The third overpass brought the same figure. So did the fourth. Each time, the man stood in the same position, the same faint wave, the same unblinking stare. By the sixth sighting, Lionel was trembling. He gripped the CB mic with sweaty hands. Breaker 19 eastbound on I-70. Any drivers seeing a hitchhiker under the overpasses tonight? Static answered him, then a faint voice. Don't stop for him. Lionel swallowed hard. Who's this? You seeing him too? But the channel went dead, the hiss of static swallowing the voice. He tried to focus on the road, tried to convince himself it was just fatigue. But when the seventh overpass appeared, his heart nearly stopped. The man was standing in the center of the road this time, directly under the bridge. Lionel swerved, horns blaring, convinced he was about to hit him. The figure never moved. The truck passed straight through as though through smoke. For a long moment afterward, Lionel couldn't breathe. His hand shook so badly he nearly lost control. When he looked in his mirrors, the road behind him was empty. He pulled into a rest stop 20 miles later, parking under bright lights, heart still hammering. He stayed in his cab until dawn, too afraid to sleep, too afraid to close his eyes. When the sun finally rose, he stepped out to stretch his legs. Another driver, an older man, walked by and gave him a knowing look. Long night? The man asked. Lionel hesitated, then nodded. You ever see a hitchhiker under the overpasses? The older driver's face tightened. Don't talk about him too much. Some say he's been there since the 70s. Driver picked him up once, never made it to the next town. They found the truck abandoned, lights on, engine running. No sign of the driver, just tracks leading back to the overpass. Lionel shivered. What do you think he wants? The man shrugged, voice low. Some folks say he's just lost, looking for a ride he never got. Others think he's hunting for someone to take his place. Either way, best not to stop. Lionel never did. In the years since, whenever he drove that stretch, he avoided looking at the overpasses. But sometimes, out of the corner of his eye, he still saw him, the pale man standing silent in the shadows, waiting for the next driver to slow down, waiting for the next ride that might never end, the radio that wouldn't turn off. Earl Patterson had been a trucker long enough to know his rig inside and out. He trusted its rhythms more than he trusted his own pulse. Every hum, every rattle, every faint squeak of the trailer was familiar. So when something behaved in a way it shouldn't, when a machine defied the rules Earl had come to rely on, it unsettled him more than anything supernatural could. It was the spring of 2014, and Earl was hauling a load of lumber from Oregon to Texas. He liked night driving, fewer cars on the road, fewer distractions, and the steady rhythm of the dark stretching ahead like an endless ribbon. His cab was quiet, except for the low rumble of the engine and the occasional burst of chatter on the CB. The miles ticked by in a kind of meditative calm. Sometime after midnight, just outside Boise, something strange happened. The CB radio crackled to life. Not unusual. Drivers often checked in, warned of hazards, or passed the time with idle talk. But this time, the voice that came through was his own. Breaker 19, this is Earl in the red Peterbilt eastbound on I-84. The words were identical to what he'd said hours earlier, almost word for word. Earl froze, hands tightening on the wheel. He hadn't keyed the mic. The radio was just replaying him. For a long moment he sat stunned, listening to his own voice describe a way station he'd passed near Nampa. The same joke he'd cracked about the coffee being bad, even the little laugh he'd given afterward. It was like hearing a recording, only he had never recorded anything. He reached for the radio and shut it off. The cab fell silent. He let out a shaky breath and told himself it was just a malfunction, some strange feedback. Electronics misbehaved all the time in trucks. But a minute later, the radio switched itself back on. His voice poured out again. Breaker 19, this is Earl in the red Peterbilt eastbound on I-84. Word for word, the same sequence. Earl stared at the dial, his knuckles white on the wheel. He turned the radio off again, even pulled the fuse, leaving the device lifeless. Yet within minutes it crackled back to life, powered by something beyond the circuitry he knew so well. His own voice filled the cab again, looping, calm, steady, unaware. He drove another 20 miles with the sound of himself echoing in the darkness. Finally, at a truck stop, he pulled over and yanked the radio completely from its mount. He set it on the passenger seat and glared at it, daring it to speak. For an hour, it stayed quiet. Then, just as he began to relax, it spoke again. But this time, the words were different. The voice was still his, unmistakably, but older, rougher, carrying a weight he didn't recognize. Earl, you can't change it. You're already on the road. You can't turn back now. Earl's blood ran cold. He picked up the radio, intending to throw it out the window, but his grip froze. His own voice continued, softer now, almost pleading. Listen to me. Slow down before mile marker 93. Please, don't make the same mistake. Shaking, Earl shoved the radio under the passenger seat and drove on. He told himself he was imagining it, that fatigue was playing tricks. Yet when mile marker 93 appeared, his headlights caught something ahead. A deer leaping across the asphalt. He braked hard, tires screaming, just missing the animal by feet. If he'd been going any faster, he would have jackknifed his rig. For the rest of that night, Earl drove in silence, the dead radio heavy as stone under the seat. He didn't touch it, didn't even look at it. But he couldn't stop thinking about the warning, about how it had been right. In the weeks that followed, the radio behaved normally. It sat back in its place, offering the usual chatter and weather updates, as though nothing had ever happened. But sometimes, late at night, when Earl was deep into a lonely stretch of road, it would flicker on by itself. And each time, it was his voice he heard. Not always warnings, sometimes just fragments of conversations he hadn't had yet. Jokes he would make hours later at a truck stop, phrases he would say to another driver the following day. Always his own voice, always out of time. He stopped telling people about it. When he mentioned it once to another driver, the man laughed and said it sounded like stress, or maybe too much coffee. But the laughter rang hollow, and Earl wondered if the man had his own stories he wasn't willing to share. Over time, Earl came to accept the radio as part of his truck, a strange companion he didn't fully understand. He never trusted it, but he never removed it either. In some ways, it felt like a mirror, not of glass, but of sound. A reflection of himself stretched across the highway, echoing from places he hadn't been yet, warning of things he couldn't see. The last time it spoke, years later, the words chilled him to the bone. His own voice, calm and certain, whispered, "This is your last run, Earl. Make it count." The next morning, his dispatcher called with unexpected news. Earl's company was downsizing, routes being cut. His seniority meant he'd be offered early retirement. That run had indeed been his last. He keeps the radio in his garage now, wrapped in cloth, never plugged in. Sometimes he thinks about throwing it away, but deep down, he can't. Because every time he remembers the warnings it gave, every time he remembers how it saved him at mile marker 93, he wonders if maybe it was never broken at all. Maybe it was simply tuned to a frequency the living rarely hear. And maybe, on quiet nights, it's still speaking. The Highway Shepherd, from Marcus Delacroix. The thing about towing is that you meet people at their worst moments. Broken down on some god-forsaken stretch of asphalt at 3 in the morning, arguing with their insurance company while their kids cry in the back seat. That's when I roll up in my rig, all amber lights and diesel rumble, like some kind of mechanical angel of mercy. Been doing this work for 15 years now, ever since I bought my Peterbilt wrecker from old Raymond Thibodeau down in Lafourche Parish. Raymond was eager to sell, almost too eager. But the price was right and the truck was solid. Chrome still gleamed like mirror glass, and that big Caterpillar engine purred like it was fresh off the factory floor. She'd have wondered why he was so quick to let her go. The first few months went smooth as silk. I worked the interstate corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, picking up the usual fare of blown tires and dead batteries. The truck handled like a dream, better than any rig I'd ever driven. Sometimes I'd catch myself talking to her during those long midnight runs, the way truckers do when the road hypnotizes you into thinking your machine has a soul. The cab stayed warm in winter without cranking the heater, and cool in summer before I even touched the air conditioning. Little things that made the job easier, made the lonely hours pass quicker. But as the weeks turned to months, I started noticing passengers I hadn't picked up. It began with just a feeling, like someone sitting in the passenger seat when I knew damn well it was empty. Peripheral vision would catch movement in the rearview mirror, but when I'd look direct, nothing there but whatever car I was hauling. The radio would tune itself sometimes, cycling through stations until it found old gospel music, or blues so ancient the voices sounded like they were calling from the bottom of a well. I told myself it was electrical problems, maybe some quirk in the truck's wiring that Raymond forgot to mention. The first time I saw one, clear as daylight, was on a fog-thick night in October. I just hooked up a silver Honda that had slid off I-10 into a ditch near Henderson Swamp. Young woman named Sarah, couldn't have been more than 25, shaking like a leaf and crying about how she'd been driving to her sister's funeral. She climbed into a friend's car that had stopped to help, and I began the slow procession back toward the interstate. That's when I glanced in my side mirror and saw her sitting in the Honda's driver's seat. Same red dress she'd been wearing, same dark hair, but her face was all wrong. Peaceful in a way that living faces never are, especially not when they've just wrecked their car on a lonely stretch of highway. She was looking right at me through the mirror, and when our eyes met, she smiled and nodded like she was saying goodbye. I nearly put my own truck in the ditch trying to get a better look, but when I checked again, the Honda was empty as a tomb. That should have been my warning to walk away. Should have parked the truck and found myself a nice safe job selling insurance or fixing air conditioners. But the work was good, and I had payments to make, And it's funny how quickly you can convince yourself that impossible things are just tricks of tired eyes and too much caffeine. The passengers became regular company after that, never more than one at a time, always riding in whatever vehicle I was towing, always wearing the clothes they'd died in. Because that's what I figured out eventually, after enough late-night internet searches and conversations with dispatchers who'd been working these roads longer than I'd been alive. Every car I hauled seemed to carry its own ghost, people who'd breathed their last behind those steering wheels or in those passenger seats. Most of them just sat quiet, staring out windows at a landscape they'd never see again. Some would wave when they caught me watching. A few even seemed to mouth words of thanks. I learned to accept them, these silent hitchhikers on their final journey. Started leaving the radio on gospel stations, figured if they were taking one last ride, might as well be with music that offered some kind of comfort. The truck seemed to approve of this arrangement. She ran smoother than ever, never broke down, never gave me a moment's trouble. The passengers became part of the routine, no more unsettling than any other aspect of working the night shift on Louisiana Highway. But everything changed the night I got the call about the accident near Lake Pontchartrain. Dispatch said it was a bad one, single vehicle that had gone through the guardrail and into 30 feet of dark water. Recovery divers had just finished pulling up a black Escalade, and they needed it transported to the state police impound lot for investigation. The driver didn't make it out. 28 years old, they told me, fell asleep at the wheel after working a double shift at the chemical plant. I backed up to the water's edge, where they had the Escalade waiting on the boat ramp, lake water still streaming from its windows like tears. The recovery team was packing up their gear, eager to get away from the scene. Can't say I blamed them. There's something about death by drowning that affects people different than other kinds of accidents. Maybe it's knowing how long that final moment stretches, how much time there is to understand what's happening. I got the Escalade hooked up without any trouble, though I noticed my hands were shaking worse than usual. The truck's engine seemed quieter too, like she was being respectful of what we were carrying. As I began the 20-mile drive to the impound lot, I found myself checking the mirrors more often than normal, wondering what kind of passenger I'd picked up this time. For the first 10 miles, the Escalade stayed empty. Just dark windows and that new drowned smell seeping through my cab's air vents, muddy and organic like the bottom of an old pond. I was starting to think maybe this would be different. Maybe some spirits were too traumatized to make the journey. But as I passed under the flickering lights of an overpass, I saw him. He was young, just like Dispatch had said, wearing a blue work shirt with his name stitched over the pocket, but unlike my other passengers, this one wasn't peaceful. Water streamed continuously from his hair and clothes, and his eyes held a wildness that made my blood run cold. He was staring at me through the rearview mirror, and his mouth was moving like he was trying to say something urgent. His hands pressed against the inside of the rear window, leaving wet handprints that shouldn't have been possible on glass that was already soaked. That's when I realized he wasn't waving goodbye like the others. He was trying to warn me. The truck's engine began to labor, though we were on flat highway with no reason for it to struggle. The temperature gauge climbed toward the red zone, and that reliable Caterpillar motor started making sounds I'd never heard before. Grinding, like metal against metal, and underneath it all, a noise that raised the hair on my arms. It sounded almost like voices, dozens of them, all talking at once in languages I couldn't understand. I glanced back at my passenger, and he was gesturing frantically now, pointing at something ahead on the road. The highway stretched empty in my headlights, nothing but wet asphalt and darkness, but the truck was slowing down despite my foot heavy on the accelerator. The steering wheel began to vibrate under my hands, and for the first time in 15 years of driving, I felt like I was losing control of my vehicle. The voices under the engine noise were getting louder, and I started to pick out individual words. Names, mostly, called out in tones of desperate longing. Sarah, who'd been driving to her sister's funeral. Tommy, the teenager who'd hit black ice last winter. Margaret, the grandmother whose heart had given out at a red light. All the passengers I'd carried, all the souls I'd delivered to their final destinations. But delivered where exactly? The truck was barely crawling now, and through the windshield I could see something that definitely hadn't been there moments before. A building materialized out of the darkness ahead, squat and windowless, like a warehouse or processing plant. No signs, no parking lot, just a structure that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The truck was pulling toward it with mechanical determination, following some route programmed into her systems long before I'd ever touched the steering wheel. My passenger was pounding on the rear window now, his mouth open in what might have been screaming, though I couldn't hear him over the chorus of voices rising from the truck's engine. I understood then what Raymond Thibodeau had been so eager to escape, why he'd sold this truck for half what it was worth, and wouldn't meet my eyes when he handed over the keys. I wasn't a tow truck driver. I was a shepherd, guiding lost souls to whatever waited for them in that lightless building ahead, and every spirit I'd delivered had made the truck stronger, more capable of fulfilling its true purpose. The voice that shouldn't be. From Marcus Chen. The CB radio crackled with the usual late-night chatter as I guided my Kenworth down Interstate 80 through the Nevada desert, my headlights cutting through the endless black that stretched between Reno and Salt Lake City. It was past 2 in the morning, and the highway belonged to us truckers and the occasional lost soul trying to make time through the wasteland. The engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a deep, throaty sound that had been my companion for the better part of 15 years hauling freight across this continent. Tonight felt different, though, in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on, like the air itself was holding its breath. The first sign something was wrong came about 20 miles east of Winnemucca, when I spotted the dog sitting perfectly still in the breakdown lane. My headlights swept over it as I approached, revealing a medium-sized mutt with patchy brown and white fur, just sitting there, like it was waiting for a bus. Dogs don't usually sit that still on busy highways, especially not at this hour. But what really caught my attention was how it turned its head to watch my truck pass, following the movement with an almost human curiosity. I'd driven past plenty of roadkill in my years and seen my share of confused animals wandering where they shouldn't be, but something about this one made me ease off the throttle. Maybe it was the way it sat so perfectly upright, or the fact that it showed no fear as 18 wheels of steel roared past just a few feet away. In my side mirror I could see it still sitting there, a small dark shape growing smaller in the red glow of my taillights. The CB came alive with static, then cleared to reveal a child's voice, high and sweet and completely out of place on the trucker frequency. "Mr. Truck Driver," the voice said, and I nearly jumped out of my seat. "Mr. Truck Driver, can you help me?" The voice was clear as crystal, with that particular cadence children have when they're trying very hard to be polite to adults they don't know. I grabbed my handset, thumb hovering over the talk button. In all my years on the road, I'd never heard a kid on the CB, and certainly not at this hour in the middle of nowhere. "This is Big Blue, eastbound on 80, I said, using my call sign. "Kid, where are you? Are you lost?" The response came immediately, that same sweet voice with just a hint of something I couldn't identify underneath it. "I'm behind you now, Mr. Truck Driver." I caught up. "I run really fast." The hairs on my arms stood up as I checked my mirrors, but there was nothing back there except empty highway and darkness. "Behind me where, exactly?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't see anybody back there, kiddo." "I'm the dog," came the reply, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. "I'm the dog you saw sitting by the road. I can talk, but only on the radio. Isn't that neat?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I fought the urge to floor the accelerator. The rational part of my mind was scrambling for explanations. Maybe some kid had found a CB radio and was playing pranks. Maybe I was more tired than I thought and starting to hear things. But deep down, in the part of me that still remembered childhood fears and the monsters that lived in dark corners, I knew something was very wrong. Dogs can't talk, I said into the handset, feeling foolish even as I said it. The laugh that came through the speaker was pure child's delight, innocent and joyful, and completely terrifying in context. This dog can. I learned how when I died. When you die on the highway, sometimes you learn new things. Want to see? I checked my mirrors again, and there it was. This same dog, somehow keeping pace with my truck despite the fact that I was doing 70 miles per hour. It ran alongside my trailer with an easy loping gait that looked almost leisurely, but there was something wrong with the way it moved, like it was floating just slightly above the asphalt. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "I want to ride with you," the child's voice said through the CB. "I've been alone out here for so long, and the other drivers won't stop. They just drive right past like they can't see me. But you looked at me. You saw me sitting there." The dog had moved up alongside my cab now, and when I looked down through the passenger window, I could see it clearly in the glow of my running lights. Its mouth wasn't moving, but somehow I knew the voice was coming from it. Its eyes reflected the light like mirrors, but there was something behind them. Something that looked almost human. "I can't stop," I told it, both through the window and into the CB. "I've got a schedule to keep, freight that needs to get where it's going." "Oh, you don't have to stop," came the cheerful reply. "I can just ride along. I won't be any trouble at all. I just want someone to talk to. It gets so lonely out here in the desert, especially at night. Do you know any games we could play?" The temperature in my cab seemed to drop 10 degrees, and I cranked up the heater, but the cold I was feeling came from inside, the kind of chill that no amount of warm air can touch. The dog was still there, still keeping impossible pace with my truck, and now I could see that its paws weren't quite touching the ground. "What kind of games?" I asked, though every instinct told me not to encourage this conversation. "Hide and seek," the voice exclaimed with childish enthusiasm, "or 20 questions. Or we could tell stories. I know lots of stories about the highway, about all the things that happen out here when people think nobody's watching." I tried to think of a way out of this situation, but nothing in my years of driving had prepared me for talking to a dead dog with a child's voice. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, empty except for my headlights and the strange companion that ran alongside my truck with supernatural endurance. "Tell me about yourself," I said, deciding that keeping it talking might be better than letting silence fall between us. "What's your name?" "I don't remember my real name," the voice said, and now there was a note of sadness in it that made my heart clench despite my fear. "But the truckers who saw me before I could talk, they called me Highway. I think I like that name. It fits, don't you think?" "How long have you been out here, Highway?" I asked. "Ooh, a very long time, years and years. I remember when the old highway was the main route before they built this big one. I've seen so many trucks, so many drivers. Most of them are in such a hurry, always rushing to get somewhere else. But nighttime is better. Nighttime drivers understand the road different." The dog had moved slightly ahead now, and I could see it in the edge of my headlight beam, still maintaining that impossible pace. Its fur seemed to ripple in ways that defied the physics of running, and occasionally it would turn its head to look up at my cab with those too bright eyes. "Where are you going, Mr. Truck Driver?" it asked. "Salt Lake City," I replied automatically, then wondered if I should have told it that. "Oh, that's a long way still. We'll have lots of time to talk. I could tell you about all the things I've seen out here. There was a driver last year who picked up a hitchhiker that wasn't really a hitchhiker, and a woman who drove the same stretch of road every night looking for something she lost. And there are places along this highway where time gets funny, where you can drive into yesterday if you're not careful." The stories it told as we drove through the Nevada darkness were unsettling in their detail, accounts of supernatural encounters and strange happenings that had the ring of truth to them. Hiawai spoke in that innocent child's voice, but the knowledge behind the words was ancient and otherworldly, like an old soul trapped in the memory of childhood. "Why are you really following me?" I finally asked as we passed a darkened truck stop, its empty parking lot dotted with the shadows of sleeping rigs. The silence stretched long enough that I began to hope it had gone away, but then the CB crackled back to life. "Because you're kind," it said simply. "I can tell. Some drivers, they have anger in them, or meanness, or they're just empty inside. But you stopped to look at me. You cared enough to worry about a dog sitting by the road. What happens when we get to Salt Lake?" I asked. "Oh, I can't go that far," Highway said, and there was genuine regret in the child's voice. "Cities are too bright, too full of living people. I can only exist out here in the empty spaces where the boundary between things, the route that runs forever." From Marcus Kane. The thing about freight hauling is that you learn to read the highways like scripture. Every mile marker and exit ramp burned into your memory after years of midnight runs. So when dispatch called me at 1:30 in the morning with a rush delivery to some warehouse outside Bakersfield, I should have known something was off about the route number they gave me. Highway 158 doesn't exist in that part of California, at least not on any map I'd ever studied, but the pay was triple my usual rate, and my rig needed new tires before winter set in properly. I pulled out of the Fresno yard at exactly 2 a.m., my Kenworth's diesel engine settling into that familiar rumble that had been my lullaby for the better part of 15 years. The trailer behind me was sealed tight, and the manifest simply read, "Agricultural Equipment," with a delivery address that seemed legitimate enough. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying hints of almond orchards and irrigation water, and my headlights carved a steady path through the darkness as I merged onto what should have been a straightforward southbound route. The first hour passed without incident, my CB radio crackling occasionally with distant chatter from other night haulers, the steady hum of rubber on asphalt, creating that meditative rhythm that long-distance drivers know so well. I'd made this general run dozens of times before, though never to this specific destination, and I found myself enjoying the solitude and the way my truck's amber running lights reflected off the guardrails and road signs that flashed past in the darkness. But somewhere around the 3-hour mark, I started noticing things that didn't quite fit the geography I knew. The terrain had become flatter than it should have been, stretching out into an endless expanse of what looked like wheat fields under the star-scattered sky, and the air coming through my slightly cracked window carried a different scent now, something like fresh-turned earth and ozone that reminded me of storms brewing on distant horizons. The road signs had changed too, though so gradually that I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened. Instead of the familiar California route markers, I was seeing numbers and place names that seemed vaguely familiar but somehow wrong, like words you know you should recognize, but can't quite recall. Highway 158 stretched ahead of me in a perfectly straight line, the yellow center stripes disappearing into infinity under the reach of my headlights. And my GPS had gone silent hours ago, its screen showing only a blank blue field with a small arrow representing my position, moving through apparent nothingness. The strangest part was the time on my dashboard clock, which seemed to have stopped advancing despite the fact that I could feel the hours passing in my bones and muscles. That deep weariness that comes from maintaining focus and control through the small hours of the morning. Every time I glanced down at the digital display, it still read 2:47 a.m., the same time it had shown for what felt like the past several hours, and when I tried to adjust it manually, the numbers would immediately snap back to that same configuration. Other trucks began appearing in my mirrors and on the road ahead, their red tail lights and amber marker lights creating small constellations in the darkness, and I felt a surge of relief at no longer being alone on this strange stretch of highway. But as I drew closer to overtake a slow-moving semi with the unmarked white trailer, I realized that the driver's cab was completely dark, no interior lighting or dashboard glow visible through the windows. And when I pulled alongside to wave or signal, there was no one behind the wheel that I could see. The same proved true for every truck I encountered on Highway 158. These ghost rigs, maintaining perfect speed and lane discipline despite their apparently empty cabs. Their trailers swaying slightly with the rhythm of the road, but their headlight beams never wavering from that straight path ahead. My CB radio had fallen silent except for a faint static that occasionally resolved into what sounded like fragments of conversation, brief snippets of voices discussing loads and destinations and delivery times, but always cutting off before I could make sense of what was being said. I tried to exit the highway several times, following off-ramps that appeared in my headlights with promising signs for fuel and food and rest, but each ramp curved around in a wide loop that somehow brought me right back to the same endless straight stretch of Highway 158, as if the road itself was refusing to let me leave. The wheat fields on either side seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, sometimes appearing closer to the road, sometimes stretching away to distant horizons, but always maintaining that same golden color that seemed wrong for this time of year and this time of night. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full despite the hours I'd been driving, and the engine showed no signs of strain or overheating, even though I hadn't stopped for my usual safety checks and rest breaks. The trailer behind me rode smooth and steady, whatever agricultural equipment it contained remaining perfectly balanced and secure. But I'd begun to wonder what exactly I was hauling, and whether the sealed doors would even open if I tried to inspect the cargo. The radio static grew stronger as the night wore on, occasionally resolving into what sounded like my own voice, giving position reports and estimated arrival times for deliveries I couldn't remember making. And once, I swore I heard dispatch responding with instructions for loads I'd never agreed to haul. The sound of my own voice coming through the speakers, calm and professional as always, discussing routes and schedules with someone I couldn't identify, sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the night air seeping through my cab. Dawn should have been breaking by now, the eastern horizon beginning to show those first pale hints of gray that every long-haul driver knows as well as their own heartbeat. But the sky remained perfectly black, stars scattered overhead in patterns that seemed too bright and too close, as if I was driving through space rather than across the familiar landscape of Central California. The other trucks continued to pass and be passed, their phantom drivers maintaining that steady pace, and I noticed that some of the rigs looked like models that hadn't been manufactured in decades, their chrome and paint jobs pristine, but their designs clearly belonging to bygone eras of trucking. I began to recognize some of the trucks after a while, the same distinctive paint schemes and trailer configurations appearing again and again in my mirrors and up ahead in the distance, as if we were all traveling in some vast circle despite the apparent straightness of the highway. A red Peterbilt with flame decals passed me a dozen times, always at the same relative position, always with that same empty cab, and I started timing the intervals, trying to find some pattern or logic to the repetition. The delivery address on my manifest began to seem like a fantasy, some destination that existed only on paper because Highway 158 showed no signs of ending or intersecting with any other roads. Mile markers flashed past in perfect sequence, but the numbers never seemed to increase beyond a certain point, cycling through the same range over and over. And I realized, with growing unease, that I might have been traveling the same stretch of highway for hours without knowing it. My attempts to call dispatch met with silence, my cell phone showing no signal despite the clear night sky. And when I tried to raise other drivers on the CB, I received no response except for that persistent static and the occasional fragment of my own voice discussing loads and routes I couldn't recall. The fuel gauge remained steady, the engine continued its reliable rumble, and Highway 158 stretched endlessly ahead through those shifting wheat fields that seemed to whisper secrets in languages I couldn't understand. As another dawn that would never come failed to break over the horizon, I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror that made my blood run cold. A reflection of my own cab that showed not my familiar face behind the wheel, but an empty driver's seat, identical to all the other ghost rigs sharing this eternal highway. When I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel, they appeared solid and real, but the mirror showed only darkness where I should have been, and I realized with dawning horror that I might have joined the ranks of those phantom drivers without even knowing when it had happened. The clock still reads 2:47 a.m., and Highway 158 still stretches ahead into infinity, and I'm beginning to understand that some loads are meant to be delivered not to destinations, but to roads that have no end, carrying cargo for companies that exist only in the space between 1 mile marker and the next, forever and always, until the last truck stops running and the final highway fades to dust. Emerald Mile, from Jake Torino. The thing about driving nights is you learn to trust your gut about light. Headlights have a warmth to them, even the cold LED ones, and streetlights cast that familiar orange glow that makes you feel like civilization's still out there waiting. But that green light I saw 40 miles outside of Barstow, California, that light was different. It burned cold, like looking at winter through colored glass. And even now, 3 weeks later, I can still feel that chill creeping up my spine whenever I close my eyes. I'd been hauling refrigerated goods from Phoenix to Los Angeles, running behind schedule because of a blown tire outside Flagstaff that had cost me 4 hours and most of my patience. My rig, a 2018 Peterbilt with nearly 500,000 miles on her, hummed steady through the Mojave darkness, her diesel engine purring that familiar lullaby that had kept me company through 10 years of long-haul driving. The radio crackled with distant voices, truckers checking in with each other across the vast emptiness, their conversations drifting in and out like ghost signals from another world. It was past 2 in the morning when I first spotted that green glow on the horizon, maybe 15 miles ahead, flickering against the low hills like some kind of aurora that had lost its way and wandered down to earth. At first I figured it might be one of those truck stops with the neon signs, the kind that advertise themselves with colors bright enough to see from space. But as I rolled closer, eating up the miles at a steady 70, that light grew stranger, more intense, casting everything around it in shades that didn't belong in the natural world. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of Interstate 40, nothing but scrub brush and Joshua trees standing like twisted sentinels in the darkness. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the night, illuminating the broken white lines that disappeared under my bumper in endless succession. The engine temperature held steady, fuel gauge showing 3/4 full, everything running smooth as silk. But something in the air had changed. The radio static grew thicker, more insistent, until the voices faded entirely and left me alone with the whisper of wind against my cab and the steady thrum of 18 wheels on asphalt. That's when I started feeling the cold. It began as just a whisper of coolness against my left arm, barely noticeable at first, like someone had cracked a window. But my windows were sealed tight, and the heater was running full blast to keep the cab comfortable. Still, that chill kept growing, seeping through my flannel shirt and settling into my bones with a persistence that made no sense. I checked the thermostat, tapped the vents, even pulled over briefly to walk around the truck and check for any obvious problem. Everything looked normal, but when I climbed back into the driver's seat and fired up the engine, that cold came right back, stronger now, focused like a beam of Arctic air, aimed directly at my heart. The green light loomed larger as I approached, no longer a distant glow, but a towering column of luminescence that seemed to stretch from the desert floor all the way up to the stars. It wasn't coming from any truck stop or billboard or cell tower, that much was clear now. This light existed on its own, pulsing with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a slow, massive heartbeat. The color was unlike anything I'd ever seen, a shade of green that seemed to exist between emerald and glacier ice, beautiful and terrible and utterly wrong. I should have taken the next exit, should have turned around and found another route, but something about that light held me captive. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, some primal instinct that draws moths to flame and sailors to sirens. My hand stayed steady on the wheel, my foot maintained pressure on the accelerator, and mile by mile I drew closer to whatever was waiting there in the desert darkness. The cold intensified with every passing moment until my breath began to fog in the cab despite the heater running at maximum. Frost started forming on the inside corners of my windshield, delicate crystalline patterns that spread like living things across the glass. I cranked the defroster, but it couldn't keep up with whatever was happening. The temperature gauge on my dashboard still read normal, the engine still purred with contentment, but the air itself seemed to be freezing around me. That's when I saw the other trucks. They were pulled off to the side of the highway, maybe a dozen of them. Big rigs and 18-wheelers parked in a rough semicircle, facing that column of green light. Their running lights were still on, red and amber dots blinking in the darkness. But there was something wrong with the scene. The trucks sat too still, too quiet, like toys abandoned by some giant child. No diesel engines rumbling, no drivers moving around checking cargo or stretching their legs. It's just silence and that cold, cold light washing over everything in waves of impossible green. I eased off the throttle and guided my rig toward the shoulder, gravel crunching under my tires as I came to a stop about 50 yards from the nearest truck. The green light bathed everything in its ethereal glow, and for the first time I could see its source clearly. Rising from a depression in the desert floor, maybe a quarter mile from the highway, stood what looked like a pillar of pure energy, 20 feet across and reaching up into the night sky until it disappeared among the stars. It pulsed with that slow, rhythmic beat, and with each pulse the cold grew more intense. I left my engine running, grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped down from my cab. The moment my boots touched the ground, the cold hit me like a physical blow, so intense it took my breath away. The air itself seemed crystalline, each breath visible as fog that hung in the still air longer than it should have. My flashlight beam looked weak and yellow against the overwhelming green radiance, but I kept it pointed ahead of me as I walked toward the nearest truck. It was a red Kenworth, maybe 5 years old, with Oregon plates and a refrigerated trailer. The driver's door stood open, and when I shined my light inside, I found the cab empty. The keys still hung in the ignition, dashboard lights glowing softly, a half-eaten sandwich sitting on the passenger seat as if the driver had just stepped away for a moment. But there was ice forming on the sandwich, ice on the steering wheel, ice creeping across the seat fabric in patterns that looked almost like writing in some unknown language. I checked 3 more trucks and found the same thing in each one. Empty cabs, engines still running, signs that the drivers had simply vanished in the middle of whatever they'd been doing. A thermos of coffee sat frozen solid in one cab. A cell phone played a voicemail message on endless loop in another, the voice of what sounded like a worried wife asking why her husband hadn't called. In the third truck, I found a logbook open to an entry dated today, the last line ending mid-sentence, the pen still sitting on the page, surrounded by a spreading circle of frost. The green light pulsed brighter, and I felt something tugging at my mind. A gentle insistence that I should walk toward that pillar of energy, should leave my truck behind and join whatever was happening out there in the desert. The cold was inside me now, flowing through my veins like liquid nitrogen, slowing my thoughts and numbing my fear until all I could feel was a kind of dreamy acceptance. It would be so easy to just walk toward that light, to let it wash over me completely, to become part of whatever beautiful, terrible thing was happening here. I took a step forward, then another, my boots crunching through frost that had formed on the desert sand. The green radiance grew brighter with each step, more welcoming, promising answers to questions I'd never thought to ask. Behind me, my truck seemed like a distant memory, unimportant compared to the wonder that waited ahead. The cold no longer bothered me, had become instead a comfort, a caress that promised rest after too many years of highways and deadlines and endless miles. That's when I heard my engine sputter. The sound cut through the dreamy haze that had settled over my mind like a knife through silk. My Peterbilt, reliable as sunrise, steady as bedrock, was missing and coughing like she was about to die. I spun around, suddenly aware of how far I'd walked from the highway, how close I'd come to that pillar of impossible light. The cold hit me again, brutal and shocking, and I realized I could barely feel my hands or feet. I ran back toward my truck, stumbling through the frost-covered sand, my breath coming in sharp puffs that crystallized and fell like tiny snowflakes. The engine continued to sputter and wheeze, and I could see ice forming on my windshield, my mirrors, creeping across the chrome like living things. Whatever that green light was, it was trying to claim my rig the same way it had claimed all the others. I threw myself into the driver. Mile 23, a bloodline in asphalt. From Marcus. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the October moon, and I was making good time on my run from Portland down to Sacramento. My Peterbilt hummed steady and true, the diesel engine's rhythm as familiar as my own heartbeat after 15 years on the road. The CB crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just me, the highway, and the gentle whoosh of air flowing over the cab. I'd driven this route dozens of times, knew every rest stop, every way station, every mile marker between the Oregon border and the California Central Valley. That's why I noticed when something wasn't right about mile marker 23. It was just past midnight when I first saw it in my headlights. Standing there on the shoulder like all the others, that familiar green reflective sign with white numbers. But as my light swept over it, I could have sworn I saw something dark running down its face. A wet streak that caught the light wrong. I glanced in my side mirror as I passed, trying to get another look, but the marker had already disappeared into the darkness behind me. Probably just rain, I told myself, though the night was clear and cloudless. Maybe some kid had thrown something at it, or a bird had made a mess of it. These things happen on long hauls when your mind starts playing tricks on you. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and reached for my thermos of coffee, letting the familiar, bitter taste ground me back in reality. The radio weather report confirmed what I could see through my windshield. Clear skies all the way down to the California line. Temperatures in the mid-40s, light winds from the west. Perfect driving weather. The kind of night that makes you grateful to be out here instead of stuck in some office cubicle. I settled back into my seat and watched the mile markers tick by in their steady progression. 24, 25, 26, each one exactly as it should be, clean and properly maintained. But when I made the return trip 3 days later, heading north with a load of electronics bound for Seattle, mile marker 23 caught my attention again. This time I was ready for it. I had been thinking about it on and off during my layover in Sacramento. As my headlights found it in the darkness, I slowed down slightly, letting my rig coast as I studied the sign. There it was again, that dark streak running down from the numbers, more pronounced now, as if whatever had caused it the first time had gotten worse. I pulled over about a quarter mile past the marker, hazards blinking in the night, and climbed down from the cab. The highway was empty in both directions, just the distant glow of a small town's lights on the horizon and the vast Oregon sky overhead. My boots crunched on the gravel shoulder as I walked back toward the sign, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness ahead of me. As I got closer, the wrongness of it became more apparent. What I had taken for some kind of stain or vandalism was something else entirely. The dark streak wasn't painted on or thrown at the marker. It was seeping from somewhere behind the numbers themselves, as if the metal itself was bleeding. I reached out tentatively and touched the wetness with my fingertip. It was warm, body temperature, and had the thick consistency of blood fresh from a wound. I jerked my hand back and wiped it on my jeans, my heart rate picking up despite my efforts to stay calm. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe there was something behind the sign, some kind of pipe or drainage that had rusted through and was leaking reddish water. I walked around to the back of the marker, playing my flashlight over the mounting posts and the ground around it, but everything looked normal. The sign was mounted on two standard steel posts driven into the earth, no pipes, no visible source for the liquid. When I returned to the front of the marker, the streak had grown longer, now extending almost to the bottom edge of the sign. I watched in growing unease as a single drop formed at the bottom of the trail, hung there for a moment, then fell to the gravel below with a soft pat. Another drop was already forming to take its place. A truck approached from the south, its headlights growing larger in the distance, and I stepped back into the shadow beside my rig as it passed. The driver probably could see me in the darkness, just another trucker pulled over for a break, but I found myself reluctant to be observed near the bleeding marker. When the taillights disappeared over the next hill, I took one more look at the sign, memorized its exact location, and climbed back into my cab. Over the next few weeks, I found myself taking this route more often than necessary, sometimes detouring from more direct paths just to check on mile marker 23. Each time I passed it, the bleeding had progressed. The dark trail grew longer and wider, and I began to notice that the ground around the base of the sign was becoming stained with whatever was flowing from above. The vegetation nearby, sparse grass and hardy weeds that grew along the highway's shoulder, had begun to turn brown and wither away. I started asking other drivers about it on the CB, casual questions about anything unusual along this stretch of highway. Most had nothing to report, but a few mentioned feeling uneasy around that particular mile marker, a sense that something wasn't quite right. One old-timer named Jerry, who'd been running this route longer than I'd been driving, told me he'd started avoiding it entirely, taking the old state highway instead when he needed to travel this direction. The breakthrough came on a foggy November night when I encountered another driver stopped near the marker. His rig was pulled over on the shoulder about where I usually parked, hazards blinking in the mist. As I slowed down, I could see him standing near the sign with a flashlight, just as I'd done weeks earlier. I pulled over behind him and walked over, my footsteps muffled by the thick fog. His name was Tom, and he'd been driving for 20 years. Like me, he'd noticed the bleeding marker and couldn't leave it alone. But Tom had done something I hadn't thought to do. He'd researched the history of this stretch of highway. What he told me made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. 15 years ago, almost to the day, a family had been killed in an accident right here at mile 23. A drunk driver had crossed the median and hit their car head-on, killing a mother, father, and their 8-year-old daughter instantly. The drunk driver had walked away with minor injuries. Tom had printed out the newspaper article about the accident and showed it to me by flashlight, the faces of the victims looking up at us from the grainy photograph. The little girl's name was Sarah, and, according to the article, she'd been on her way to visit her grandmother for Thanksgiving. The family had been buried together in a cemetery about 10 miles from here, but there had never been any kind of roadside memorial erected at the accident site. No crosses, no flowers, no acknowledgement of what had happened here except for the official accident report filed away in some state database. As Tom finished telling me the story, we both turned to look at the mile marker. The bleeding had accelerated, the dark stream now flowing steadily down the face of the sign and pooling on the ground below. In the foggy darkness, with the story of Sarah and her parents fresh in my mind, the sight was deeply unsettling. It was as if the highway itself was weeping for what had happened here, marking the spot where innocence had been lost. Tom and I stood there in the fog for a long time, watching the marker bleed, neither of us speaking. Finally, he folded up the newspaper article and put it back in his jacket pocket. We shook hands without saying much more, an unspoken understanding passing between us. Some things on the highway couldn't be explained, only witnessed and remembered. I still drive past mile marker 23 regularly, and the bleeding continues. Sometimes it's just a thin trickle, other times it flows more freely, but it never stops completely. I've never seen it during daylight hours, only at night, when the headlights catch that dark stream against the reflective green surface. Other drivers have started to notice it too, and word is spreading through the trucking community about the marker that bleeds. Last week, I saw something new. Someone had left a small bouquet of flowers at the base of the sign, wilted and rain-soaked, but unmistakably placed there intentionally. I don't know who left them, or how they knew about Sarah and her parents, but it felt right somehow. The highway remembers what happened here, even if the rest of the world has moved on. I keep driving, keep watching, keep bearing witness to whatever force compels mile marker 23 to weep in the darkness. Every time I pass it, I whisper Sarah's name into the night air, a small acknowledgement that she was here, that her life mattered, that some things are too important to be forgotten, even after the road records have been filed away and the accident statistics have been compiled. The highway keeps its The Passenger Made of Steam. From Marcus Holloway. I've been hauling freight across the Continental Divide for 23 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the highway could throw at me. Night shifts, ice storms, mechanical failures that left me stranded in places where the darkness felt thick enough to touch. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that foggy October evening, when my radiators started speaking to me in the shape of a man. The trouble began just outside of Billings, Montana, where the plains stretch endlessly under a sky that seems to press down with the weight of eternity. I was driving my '98 Peterbilt, Old Faithful as I called her, loaded down with construction equipment bound for Seattle. The weather had been cooperative all day, crisp autumn air that made the diesel engine purr like a contented cat. But as the sun disappeared behind the Beartooth Mountains, a peculiar fog began to roll across the interstate, thick and luminous in my headlights, moving against the wind in ways that defied explanation. The first sign of trouble came as a subtle change in the engine's rhythm. Old Faithful had always been reliable, her Detroit diesel humming with the consistency of a heartbeat, but now there was an irregularity, a slight hesitation that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. The temperature gauge began to climb, not dramatically, but enough to draw my attention away from the hypnotic swirl of fog that seemed to be following my truck like a living thing. I pulled into a truck stop called Murphy's Last Chance, a weathered establishment that squatted beside the highway like a tired animal. The neon sign flickered intermittently, casting red and blue shadows across the fog that now surrounded the place completely. Only 2 other rigs sat in the parking lot, their running lights creating small islands of warmth in the growing darkness. The silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of my cooling engine and the distant hum of electrical transformers. Hopping the hood revealed the source of my troubles. The radiator cap had worked itself loose, allowing coolant to escape in steady streams of vapor that rose into the cold night air. Nothing unusual about that, really. Mechanical failures were part of the job, and I dealt with overheating engines more times than I could count. What struck me as odd was the way the steam moved, not dissipating randomly as physics would dictate, but gathering itself into patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost purposeful. I tightened the cap and topped off the coolant from a jug I kept behind the driver's seat, watching as the steam continued to billow upward in the beam of my flashlight. The fog had grown thicker while I worked, transforming the truck stop into an island of dim light, surrounded by an ocean of gray nothingness. The other trucks had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the mist as if they had never existed at all. When I climbed back into the cab and turned the key, Old Faithful responded with her usual reliability, but the temperature gauge remained higher than normal, hovering in the yellow zone that meant caution. Back on the highway, the fog seemed to press against my windshield with an almost physical presence. My headlights penetrated only a few yards ahead, creating a tunnel of visibility that moved with me through the vast Montana darkness. The radio had fallen to static, and even the CB was silent, as if every other driver on the continent had simply vanished. The only sounds were the diesel engine's steady rumble and the rhythmic swish of my wipers clearing condensation from the glass. That's when I first saw him in my passenger seat. At first it was just a suggestion in my peripheral vision, a density in the air that might have been a trick of the dashboard light reflecting off the fog that had somehow seeped into the cab. But as the miles rolled beneath my wheels, the presence became more distinct, more undeniably there. Steam continued to rise from the vents, curling and twisting in the warm air of the cab, but instead of dissipating, it began to collect and coalesce into something that resembled a human silhouette. The figure was translucent and ever-shifting, made entirely of radiator steam that somehow maintained its shape despite the laws of physics. It sat perfectly still in the passenger seat, facing forward as if watching the road ahead with the same attention I was. No facial features were visible, just the vague outline of a head and shoulders composed of vapor that glowed faintly in the instrument panel's green light. When I tried to look directly at it, the apparition seemed to fade, becoming almost invisible, but when I focused on the highway ahead, it returned to my peripheral vision with startling clarity. The temperature gauge continued to climb, and with it the steam passenger became more solid, more present. I could hear no breathing, no movement, but there was an undeniable sense of companionship, as if someone was indeed riding shotgun through the endless Montana night. The fog outside seemed to respond to the presence, swirling in patterns that matched the movement of the steam figure, as if the two phenomena were connected in ways I couldn't begin to understand. Miles passed in this strange communion. The steam passenger never moved or spoke, but its presence filled the cab with an otherworldly calm that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. When I reached for the CB radio to see if anyone else was experiencing similar phenomena, the figure turned its head toward me with a motion so smooth and deliberate that my hand froze halfway to the microphone. Though it had no visible eyes, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical thing, and something in that eyeless gaze warned me against breaking the silence that had settled between us. The road began to climb as we approached the Continental Divide, and Old Faithful's engine worked harder, her temperature gauge edging toward the red zone that meant serious trouble. The steam passenger seemed to grow more solid with each degree of heat, its form becoming so distinct that I could make out the suggestion of clothing, the outline of hands resting calmly on translucent knees. The fog outside had thickened to an almost supernatural density, reducing my world to the small space inside the cab and the few feet of highway illuminated by my headlight. Then, as we crested the divide and began the long descent toward Idaho, the steam figure finally moved. It turned toward me with that same fluid motion and raised one vaporous hand to point at something ahead in the fog. I leaned forward, straining to see what had captured its attention, and gradually became aware of lights in the distance, the familiar glow of another truck stop, cutting through the murk. But as we drew closer, something felt wrong about those lights. They were too bright, too pure, like stars that had fallen to earth and lay scattered across the landscape. The steam passenger's pointing became more urgent, though urgency might not be the right word for something made of vapor and heat. There was an insistence in the gesture, a warning that made my foot instinctively ease off the accelerator. The truck stop, when we finally reached it, was unlike any I'd ever seen. The building seemed to glow from within, its windows casting perfect rectangles of golden light across a parking lot filled with trucks from every era of American freight hauling. I saw rigs from the 1000, 970S, alongside modern drivers, all sitting silent and still, as if waiting for drivers who would never return. The neon signs were too bright, too perfect, free of the flicker and decay that marked every real truck stop I'd ever visited. As I slowed to consider whether to pull in, the steam passenger became agitated for the first time since its appearance. The figure began to wave both hands in what could only be interpreted as a warning, its form becoming more solid and distinct with each passing second. The temperature gauge needle was now firmly in the red, and I could hear the coolant boiling in the radiator, but something about the passenger's frantic gesturing convinced me to keep driving, to pass by this too-perfect oasis in the fog. The moment we cleared the truck stop's lights, the steam passenger settled back into its calm pose, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the fog began to thin. The temperature gauge slowly retreated from the danger zone, and the steam rising from the vents diminished until my translucent companion began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. Within 20 miles, the fog had lifted entirely, revealing a star-filled sky and the normal darkness of a Montana night. When I finally stopped at a legitimate truck stop 50 miles down the road, Old Faithful's engine was running at normal temperature. The radiator showed no signs of overheating, the coolant level was exactly where it should be, and every system checked out perfectly. I sat in the parking lot for a long time, watching the ordinary steam rise from other trucks' exhaust stacks, wondering if I had experienced something supernatural or simply hallucinated from highway hypnosis and diesel fumes. I never saw that glowing truck stop again, despite traveling that same route dozens of times over the years. Other drivers I have talked to mention strange fog in that area, and more than one has described seeing lights where no truck stop should exist. But none have admitted to having a passenger made of steam. Sometimes, though, when the weight of nothing, from Marcus Cole, the CB radio crackled with static as I guided my Peterbilt through the Missouri countryside, hauling 26 tons of steel beams toward Kansas City. It was one of those humid September nights where the air hung thick as molasses, and even with the air conditioning running full blast, my shirt stuck to the leather seat. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m., and I'd been driving for 8 hours straight, my eyes burning from staring into the cone of my headlights as they carved through the darkness ahead. I'd been running this route for 12 years, ever since my divorce finalized, and I needed the steady income that long-haul trucking provided. Every mile of Highway 65 was etched into my memory like grooves in an old vinyl record. I knew every curve, every hill, every overpass between here and my destination. The rhythm of the road had become my meditation, the steady drum of 18 wheels on asphalt mixing with the low growl of my diesel engine to create a symphony that lulled me into that strange state of hypnotic alertness that only long-distance drivers truly understand. The radio had been quiet for the past hour, which wasn't unusual for this stretch. Most drivers were either asleep in their cabs at truck stops or pushing through like me, focused on making their delivery windows. The silence was comfortable, familiar even, broken only by the occasional pop of static or the distant murmur of a conversation bleeding through from another channel. I reached for my thermos of coffee, now lukewarm and bitter, but still potent enough to keep my eyelids from growing heavy. That's when I first noticed the construction signs. Orange reflective diamonds began appearing along the shoulder, their bright warnings catching my headlights like cat eyes in the darkness. "Road work ahead," they proclaimed, followed by "right lane closed" and "reduce speed." I frowned, downshifting as my rig began to slow. This was new. I'd made this exact run just 3 weeks ago, and there hadn't been any construction then. Highway departments usually gave truckers advance notice of major projects, especially ones that affected major shipping corridors like this one. The signs continued for several miles, creating an orange constellation along the roadside. My CB remained eerily quiet. Usually drivers would be chattering about delays, alternate routes, or complaining about construction zones that appeared overnight. But tonight the airwaves carried nothing but the soft hiss of static, as if I were the only soul traveling this stretch of asphalt. As I crested a small hill, I saw it looming ahead, the Clearwater Overpass. Even in the darkness, I could make out its familiar silhouette against the star-scattered sky. The overpass was nothing special, just a simple concrete span that carried County Route 47 over the highway. I'd passed beneath it hundreds of times without giving it a second thought, but tonight something felt different. Work lights blazed beneath the structure, harsh and clinical white against the warm yellow of my headlights. I could see the shapes of construction equipment, a crane, several trucks, what looked like scaffolding wrapped around the bridge supports. Men in hard hats and reflective vests moved about like ants, their movements purposeful but oddly synchronized. As I approached, one of them stepped into the roadway, holding up a stop sign on a long wooden handle. I brought my rig to a gradual halt, air brakes hissing softly. The flagman approached my driver's side window and I rolled it down, expecting to hear about delays or perhaps a pilot car escort. But when he looked up at me, his face was pale and drawn, his eyes holding an expression I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or something deeper and more troubling. "How long's the wait going to be?" I called down to him, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to be listening to something I couldn't hear, his head cocked slightly to one side. In the work lights behind him, I noticed that the other construction workers had stopped moving. They stood frozen in place, as if someone had pressed a pause button on their activities. "Not long now," the flagman finally said, his voice carrying an odd echo despite the open air. "Just need to make sure everything's secure." I nodded and settled back in my seat, letting the engine idle. Through my side mirror, I could see that no other traffic had joined the queue behind me. The highway stretched empty in both directions, which seemed impossible for a major shipping route, even at this hour. I reached for my CB microphone, intending to call out for a traffic report, or maybe just to hear another human voice. But when I keyed the mic, only silence came back, not even static. That's when I started to really pay attention to what was happening beneath the overpass. The construction workers moved in perfect unison now, their actions so coordinated they seemed choreographed. They weren't working on the bridge supports as I'd initially thought. Instead, they appeared to be removing something. Concrete barriers, steel reinforcements, anything that might provide structural support. As I watched, a section of scaffolding was carefully dismantled and loaded onto a truck. The crane swung into position, its hook descending toward what looked like a critical support beam. A chill ran down my spine despite the humid night air. Construction crews reinforced bridges. They didn't systematically dismantle their load-bearing elements, and certainly not at 3 a.m. on an active highway. I looked back toward the flagman, intending to ask what kind of work they were actually doing, but he was no longer looking at me. His attention was fixed on something above us, and when I followed his gaze, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The overpass was beginning to sag. It was subtle at first, just a slight downward bow in the concrete span that might have been a trick of the harsh work lights and shifting shadows. But as I continued to watch, transfixed with growing horror, the sag became more pronounced. Hairline cracks began to appear in the concrete, dark spiderwebs that spread outward from the center of the span. And still, the construction workers continued their methodical removal of support structures, as if they were following some predetermined plan to bring the entire bridge down. I grabbed for the door handle, suddenly desperate to get out of my truck and away from what was clearly about to become a disaster zone. But the handle wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, panic beginning to claw at the edges of my consciousness. But it was as if the mechanism had been welded shut. The window controls were similarly unresponsive, trapping me in my cab like an insect in amber. The flagman turned back toward me then, and in the harsh glare of the work lights, I could see that his face was no longer quite human. His features had become fluid, shifting and changing even as I watched. His mouth opened in what might have been a smile or a scream, revealing darkness where his teeth should have been. When he spoke, his voice seemed to come from inside my own head rather than through my ears. "The weight," he said, and I could feel each word vibrating through my skull. "Always comes the weight. 26 tons of steel beams, pressing down, pressing through. The bridge remembers every load, every truck, every pound of cargo that passed beneath. and now it's tired, so very, very tired. Above us, the concrete span groaned like a living thing in pain. Chunks of debris began to rain down on my windshield, each impact like a gunshot in the confined space of my cab. I could see the massive steel beams in my trailer through the side mirrors, suddenly understanding with crystalline clarity what was about to happen. The bridge was going to collapse, and my cargo, all 26 tons of it, was going to be crushed beneath concrete and rebar, with me trapped inside the cab. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the growing realization that this had happened before. The flagman's words echoed in my mind. The bridge remembers every load, every truck, every pound of cargo. How many drivers had sat in this exact spot, watching the same impossible construction crew systematically weaken the overpass? How many trucks were already buried beneath that innocent-looking span of concrete? The crane's hook caught a critical support beam, and with agonizing slowness began to lift it away. The overpass shuddered, a deep bass note that I felt more than heard. Cracks spread across the concrete like lightning, and chunks of debris fell more frequently now, drumming against my truck with increasing intensity. In my mirrors, I could see my trailer beginning to buckle under the weight of falling concrete. I closed my eyes and pressed my foot to the accelerator, not caring about the flagman or the construction zone or anything except getting out from under that dying bridge. My rig lurched forward, diesel engine roaring, but instead of the expected impact or collision, I felt only smooth highway beneath my wheels. The harsh work lights faded, the sound of falling concrete ceased, and when I opened my eyes, I was rolling down an empty stretch of Highway 65 under a normal starfall.